You could live without many things in the ancient world. Shoes were negotiable. Privacy was a fantasy. Toothpaste had not yet entered the chat. But water, clean, drinkable water, was not optional. It was not a lifestyle preference. It was a ticking clock that started the moment you woke up and never stopped. Modern life has spoiled us. Today, water is background noise. You turn a handle, and there it is. Clear, odourless, suspiciously obedient. In ancient cities, water was not a utility. It was a daily negotiation with reality. You didn't ask if you'd get water today. You asked how risky that water was going to be. The first threat wasn't disease, it was thirst. Hello, travellers. Before we step into the crowded streets of ancient cities where clean water was never guaranteed, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're hearing this story unfold. Now, let's begin. The human body is generous with food shortages. It will stretch calories, burn fat, cannibalize muscle, and keep going with grim determination. Water, however, gets no such flexibility. Dehydration does not bargain. Within a day, your mouth dries. Within 2, your urine darkens and your head pounds. By day 3, your body begins to fail at basic maintenance. Blood thickens, temperature regulation slips, confusion creeps in. You don't collapse dramatically, you unravel. And ancient cities were dehydration machines. Crowded populations meant competition. Wells ran low, rivers shifted, rain failed, storage containers leaked. Even when water existed, access wasn't guaranteed. Fetching it took time, strength, and sometimes money. Miss a day, and your body noticed immediately. Miss 2, and it started keeping score. But thirst wasn't the real long-term killer. It was just the opening act. If dehydration didn't end you first, contaminated water waited patiently behind it. This is where ancient survival became cruelly ironic. The very thing keeping you alive was also quietly sabotaging you. Water didn't have to look dangerous, in fact it usually didn't. Clear water felt safe. Flowing water felt trustworthy. Cold water felt pure. None of those impressions meant anything. People drank not because the water was clean, but because the alternative was faster death. This is where survival timelines get uncomfortable. You could technically survive several days without water. But surviving with bad water often meant dying slowly instead. Waterborne illness didn't strike like a sword. It drained you. It weakened you. It emptied you, sometimes literally, until your body no longer had enough strength to keep fluids inside itself. And here's the worst part. Ancient people didn't understand the trade they were making. There was no visible countdown clock hovering above the well, no warning label floating in the river. When you drank, you weren't choosing between safe and unsafe. You were choosing between now and later. Thirst demanded immediate obedience. Disease could wait. So people drank. They drank knowing the water tasted wrong. They drank knowing it sometimes made them sick. They drank knowing that last time someone didn't recover. But thirst doesn't care about memory. Thirst is urgent. Thirst is persuasive. Thirst doesn't explain consequences. It only promises relief. This is why ancient survival wasn't heroic. There were no last stands against dehydration, no noble resistance to bacteria. Most deaths tied to water didn't feel like battles. They felt like ordinary days that went slightly worse than usual. You woke up tired, you drank, you felt off, you drank again, you weakened, you rested, you drank more. The body loses water faster than it can replace it. Muscles cramp. Thoughts blur. The line between dehydration and disease becomes irrelevant because both are now happening at once, and no one around you is surprised. In ancient cities, sickness wasn't an emergency. It was background noise. People didn't ask why water hurt them. They asked when they'd feel better, and when they didn't, life simply stepped around the gap they left behind. That's the brutal truth of the countdown. Survival wasn't measured in years or months. It wasn't even measured in seasons. It was measured in access, timing, and luck. Miss water entirely and the body shuts down quickly. Drink the wrong water and the body slowly sabotages itself from the inside. Either way, the clock keeps ticking. The good news, you're alive today. The bad news, so is the water. If hunger is a slow, grumbling complaint from your stomach, thirst is a full-scale rebellion staged by every cell in your body. Hunger negotiates. Hunger bargains. Hunger says, listen, we can make this work. I'll eat your fat. You eat your pride. Thirst, on the other hand, does not negotiate. It simply packs up your internal organs and starts shutting down departments like a failing business. This is the biological reality people in ancient cities lived with every single day. You can go weeks without food, but only a few days without water, and even those days are not pleasant. Hunger may make you miserable, irritable, and dramatically poetic, but thirst makes you dysfunctional. Hunger gives you time to hope. Thirst gives you a deadline. The human body is inconveniently mostly water, not metaphorically, literally. Blood is watery, cells are watery. Even your eyeballs are 98% stay hydrated and 2% please don't poke me. This means water isn't a luxury. It's the medium your entire existence swims in. When you lose water, everything begins to wobble. The average person loses water constantly through sweat, breath, urine, tears, especially during ancient medical procedures, and digestion. And because ancient cities didn't offer climate control, refrigeration, or the revolutionary invention of shade, people were basically walking fountains all day long. Every errand, every chore, every market trip, everything cost water. Now imagine living in a world where replacing that water was never easy, never guaranteed, and never clean. Ancient bodies lived in a constant state of quiet, fluid panic. Start with day one without water. Your mouth dries, your lips tighten, and suddenly every conversation becomes an exercise in tongue-based sandpaper. Your body politely suggests you drink something, anything, water, wine, weak beer, questionable puddle. Look, it's not picky, just drink. But if you don't, day two hits harder. Your urine turns the colour of ancient amber. Your heart rate ticks upward because your blood is now thicker than your average soup. Your brain, which is composed of mostly water, begins to malfunction. Thoughts slow, decisions wobble. You start forgetting useful things like names, tasks, and the reason you were walking toward that clay pot in the first place. And if you still haven't had water? Day 3 isn't even subtle. Muscles cramp. Heat becomes unbearable. Your body tries to sweat but can't, which is terrible because sweating is its air conditioning system. Your lungs feel dry, your skin feels tight, and your brain begins sending signals best described as desperate flapping. After this, each additional hour is a hazard. Without water, the body breaks faster than any other deprivation short of being stabbed. Hunger, by comparison, is polite. When you stop eating, your body quietly switches to emergency settings. It taps reserves. It burns fat. It slows metabolism. It grumbles, complains, and fantasizes about bread, but it keeps going. People have survived for weeks, sometimes longer, without food. The body saves itself by stretching every calorie like a medieval servant stretching broth. Water offers no such generosity. You cannot stretch it. You cannot ration what you don't have. You either drink or you decline. This made ancient life uniquely stressful. Imagine waking up knowing your body had already used up part of its daily water supply just by existing. Breathing spends water. Walking spends water. Standing in the sun for too long. Congratulations! Your body spent half its water on trying not to cook you. Now imagine that same body depending on water sources that were unreliable at best and suspicious at worst. You needed water daily, but the water available might have been muddy, stale, exposed, shared, contaminated, or formerly occupied by insects. So yes, ancient people were tough, but their bodies lived under relentless pressure. Every day began with the same invisible question. Will I get enough water today to function tomorrow? And while hunger affected nearly everyone in the ancient world, thirst targeted people faster. Labourers working under the sun, at risk. Herdsmen walking long distances, at risk. Children, extremely at risk. Elderly, constantly at risk. Basically, if you had a pulse, thirst was waiting for its turn. People developed coping strategies, but none changed the biology. They drank small amounts constantly. They sought shade like animals. They avoided the hottest parts of the day. They diluted wine. They ate watery fruits or broths when they could afford them. But still, the human body demanded water relentlessly, and ancient cities often failed to supply it safely, or at all. This is what made thirst such a terrifying companion. Hunger could haunt you for a week before becoming lethal. Thirst, it didn't bother haunting. It walked openly beside you, pointing at your shrinking timeline. Your body forgives skipped meals. It does not forgive skipped water. If you imagine ancient city planners poring over blueprints, weighing comfort, airflow, sanitation, and aesthetic beauty, erase that image immediately. Ancient city planning began with one question, and one question only. Is there water? If the answer was yes, congratulations. That patch of land, regardless of smell, terrain, mosquitoes, or general vibe, was about to become a bustling metropolis. Life's first rule in antiquity wasn't location, location, location. It was hydration, or you die. Civilizations didn't form near water because the scenery was nice, or the sunsets were inspiring. They formed there because human beings, animals, crops, and entire economies were chained to water like an overprotective ghost. Rivers, springs, and shallow groundwater were the lifelines of survival. Comfort, however, was politely excused from the conversation. Cleanliness was told it could join later, and then somehow never received the invitation. Consider the river. In the ancient world, rivers were everything all at once. Highways, refrigerators, bathtubs, fishing spots, laundromats, and occasionally disastrous flood zones. People didn't gather around rivers because they offered predictability. Rivers were famously unpredictable. They flooded when you didn't want them to, dried up when you desperately needed them, and occasionally relocated themselves without consulting anyone. But a river flowed, and that was enough. If it flowed, people moved in. If it smelled, they ignored it and moved in anyway. Springs were even more prized, pure water bubbling up from the earth, cool and fresh. A spring could transform an unremarkable hillside into a settlement, a town, then a city-state. Entire kingdoms fought over springs. Battles were waged because a particular patch of wet dirt produced water that didn't taste like regret. But springs were fickle. They could diminish in droughts, clog with sediment, or simply stop flowing because nature got bored. Ancient people knew this, and yet they kept building around springs because a good water source wasn't just valuable, it was irreplaceable. Then there were wells, the ancient equivalent of gambling with a shovel. Dig down and hope. Hope for water. Hope for purity. Hope you didn't accidentally strike a limestone layer that made your water taste like sadness. Wells transformed inland regions into livable spaces, but they required maintenance, depth, and constant vigilance. A well was only as good as the water table beneath it, and ancient wells could run dry faster than your patience on a hot day. Still, none of these water sources guaranteed cleanliness. That was not a deal-breaker, because sanitation in ancient city planning ranked roughly where free Wi-Fi ranks today. It's nice, but no one's moving cities for it. Ancient builders didn't choose locations because they offered tidy drainage or clean surroundings. They built wherever they could drink, even if the surrounding terrain was swampy, flood-prone, mosquito-infested, or smelled like the city's future sewage crisis. The logic was simple. It's better to be wet and alive than dry and dead. This meant ancient cities often grew in places that modern city planners would reject instantly. Low riverbanks, floodplains, deltas, places that came pre-installed with mud, dampness, bugs, and annual disasters. But people stayed because leaving meant finding a better water source, and those weren't exactly scattered around like decorative fountains. Some cities grew around waterfalls, which offered both fresh water and power. Others clustered near oases in deserts, forming dense population centres where every drop mattered. In mountainous regions, communities perched beside melting snow streams, risking landslides but enjoying water so cold it probably counted as personality development. In all these cases, water dictated settlement patterns, not comfort. Homes were squeezed together into cramped quarters because the closer you were to the water source, the easier your life was. Wealthier districts positioned themselves conveniently near water access. Poorer neighbourhoods sprawled outward, farther away, sacrificing convenience and health for affordability. An early preview of socio-economic geography that, unfortunately, never went out of style. And because water access dictated everything, ancient cities often expanded chaotically. Streets twisted, alleys narrowed. Houses stacked themselves in improbable directions. There was no master plan, only adaptation. If new families moved in, they built wherever they could find a patch of earth not already claimed by someone else's roof or goat. Cleanliness was the last thing on anyone's mind, because the ancient relationship with water was one of sheer necessity. People did not ask whether their water source was pristine. They asked whether it existed. Water quality was secondary. Water quantity was survival. The city might smell like damp livestock, river mud, and a hint of despair, but that didn't matter. It had water. And in the ancient world, water was the only luxury that mattered, even if it came with accessories you did not ask for, floating or otherwise. If rivers were the ancient world's restless life-givers, and springs were its temperamental miracles, then wells were the DIY hope project of every settlement. Dig down, pray, and see what happens. Wells were humanity's attempt to negotiate directly with the earth. The results were mixed. A communal well sat at the heart of many ancient cities, and it looked deceptively innocent. Just a stone ring with a rope, a bucket, and a suspiciously damp perimeter. But this was not simply a water source. It was a social hub, a survival tool, and a bacterial handshake shared by the entire community. Wells were convenient, yes. Clean? That was a strong word. Reliable? Only on the days when fate was feeling generous. Most wells were shallow, dug just deep enough to tap into local groundwater. The issue is that shallow groundwater is a lot like a neighbourhood gossip. It picks up everything happening around it. Rain runoff, animal waste, human waste, spilled liquids, decomposing matter, and whatever washed in from yesterday's market. All of it had the opportunity to join the water supply. And then there was the human traffic. A well in an ancient city was never empty. At dawn, women lined up carrying ceramic jars. At midday, servants filled buckets for kitchens and bathhouses. Children came to splash, play, and inevitably drop things they should not have been holding. Animals wandered in, drinking directly from the pooling overflow. Stray dogs sniffed the edges. Donkeys contributed their opinions on hydration. The well was the busiest and least supervised location in town. But the real chaos lived inside the bucket. Yes, the water itself might have started its journey clean. Groundwater can be beautifully filtered by soil, sand, and stone, but the bucket, the rope, the pulley system, these items had seen things. They carried the fingerprints, spills, dirt, sweat, and probably emotional trauma of everyone who ever used them. The bucket was lowered many times a day, scraping the sides, collecting silt, algae, and whatever was living in the damp wooden grain. It went from hand to hand, jar to jar, mouth to mouth. Hygiene was not the bucket's strong suit. In fact, hygiene wasn't even introduced to the bucket as a concept. The logic was simple. The water is fresh. The bucket has seen things. Many things. Then came animal runoff, the uninvited guest at every well. Livestock wandering near the central square created a steady supply of manure, and when rain arrived, everything flowed downhill straight toward the well. Ancient cities were not known for their perfect drainage systems. They were known for puddles of uncertain origin, and those puddles often led via charming little gullies right into the place where drinking water was stored. People knew wells were risky, but they also knew the alternative was worse. Fetching water from a river could take hours, especially when you lived at the top of a hill or outside the main district. Springs might be seasonal or too far away. So despite their flaws, wells were the most accessible option for daily life. Some cities tried to protect their wells. They built stone casings, drainage channels, or small roofs overhead. They posted guards or attendants to regulate use. But even the best designed well could fall victim to contamination if people ignored the rules, which predictably they often did. Take the issue of washing. In many places, people rinsed vegetables, tools, or clothes near the well. They didn't dunk items directly into the water. That was considered uncivilized. But washing near the mouth of the well still created runoff that collected at the edges and percolated downward. Even worse, a dropped object, say, a chicken, which definitely happened at least once in human history, could cause disaster. Retrieving a fallen bucket was easy. Retrieving a fallen chicken was more complicated, not to mention the cleanup required afterward. And let's not forget the possibility of well poisoning, whether accidental or intentional. People disposing of waste improperly could pollute the well for everyone. In times of conflict, enemies sometimes contaminated wells deliberately, because nothing cripples a city faster than water you cannot drink. Wells were strategic assets, and therefore strategic liabilities. Despite all of this, wells remained indispensable, because no matter how questionable they were, they offered something priceless: accessibility. Water you could reach without hiking a mile, without carrying jars uphill, without bargaining with a river current. Wells supported kitchens, bathhouses, artisans, temples, markets, and livestock. They provided hydration, cooking water, cleaning water, and sometimes a place to cool your feet when no one was looking. They were simultaneously the best and worst parts of ancient city life. People drank from wells every day, knowing the risks, but trusting the earth more than the river, the sky, or their neighbours' sanitation habits. It was a gamble, but it was a familiar gamble, one that societies made for thousands of years, because convenience beats fear, and in the ancient world a risky well was still safer than a long walk, and infinitely safer than thirst. If ancient wells were questionable, rivers were downright philosophical. They were beautiful from a distance, useful up close, and dangerous the moment you took a sip. Rivers were the great multitaskers of the ancient world. Transport routes, fishing grounds, laundry stations, religious sites, waste disposal units, and, unfortunately, drinking fountains. In other words, rivers were everything except clean. The problem wasn't that ancient people were reckless. The problem was that rivers didn't come with instruction manuals. They looked pure. They sounded fresh. The water flowed constantly, which tricked people into believing it cleaned itself. Spoiler, it did not. Rivers operated on a simple and horrible reality. Everything upstream became someone else's downstream, which meant that by the time the water reached your city, it had already lived several lives, none of them sanitary. Whatever went into the river upstream came back downstream with opinions, personality, and occasionally additional passengers. Ancient people didn't fully understand contamination, but they absolutely understood hierarchy. And rivers had one of their own. Upstream towns, lucky, blessed, drinking water that had only touched rocks, fish, and the occasional deer. Midstream towns, moderately cursed, drinking water that had been lightly seasoned by upstream bathers, laundry, and livestock. Downstream towns, professionally doomed. Let's imagine a typical day along a river serving multiple ancient settlements. Upstream in Village A, people wake at dawn and head straight for the water. Someone washes clothes, someone else bathes, another person fills buckets for cooking. Livestock are brought down to drink. A child drops something into the current and cries. A fisherman guts a fish with enthusiasm and no clean-up plan. Waste from yesterday's butcher shop is tossed in without ceremony. It all swirls together, merrily downstream. Enter village B, sitting innocently further along the river. They approach the same water, unaware it is carrying the memories of village A. They drink it, they cook with it, they rinse produce in it, they refill jugs from it, and then they create their own contributions. Waste, wash water, fish guts, pottery scraps, and send those downstream as a thoughtful gift to village C. By the time the river reaches a big city, say, a bustling ancient capital with thousands of people, the water has been used, reused, and overused to a degree that defies polite description. Yet the city still depends on it. Rivers weren't just convenient, they were essential. They sat at the centre of trade, food supplies, and daily survival. People needed water every day, and didn't always have wells or springs to rely on. So despite the risks, rivers remained the primary source of hydration for countless communities. Ancient people weren't oblivious. They knew the river had moods. They understood that after storms the water ran brown and tasted like disappointment. They recognized that drinking downstream from a tannery was a bad idea. They avoided spots where carcasses drifted, where waste accumulated, where animals congregated. But avoidance only helped so much, because contamination didn't respect boundaries. One person's laundry spot was another person's drinking station. One person's public bath area was another person's irrigation channel. One city's sewer outlet, usually just a stone pipe that politely dumped everything into the river, was another city's water supply. And no one realized germs existed. To them, the problem wasn't microscopic pathogens. The problem was flavor. Murky water tasted wrong, slimy water felt wrong, and smelly water offended the senses. But if the river ran fast and looked clear, people trusted it. Clarity was the ancient version of a safety certificate. This trust sometimes bordered on heroic optimism. In some cities, the same stretch of river was used for drinking, then for washing, then for waste disposal, all in a neat linear system that functioned beautifully until you asked, wait, which direction is the water flowing? Rivers also carried runoff from rainstorms, sweeping through markets, cemeteries, livestock pens, dung heaps, and trash piles. Everything that wasn't anchored down was invited to join the journey. People understood rivers changed colour and texture after rainfall, but they assumed the water would settle. It did not settle. It simply disguised its history in a more picturesque current. And yet, despite the hazards, rivers remained beloved. They were scenic. They were cool on hot days. They provided fish, transportation, and the illusion of purity. Rituals took place along the water. Markets lined the banks. Homes were built with river views, because even if the river was carrying half a village's laundry residue and digestive consequences, it still sparkled in the sun. The river was life. The river was danger. And for ancient people, the river was both truths at once. The irony is that rivers didn't become safer as towns grew. They became progressively worse. More people meant more waste. More industry meant more runoff. More agriculture meant more fertilizer flowing directly into the water. Yet reliance on the river never decreased, because alternative water sources required infrastructure that many ancient cities lacked. In short, ancient river water was a communal soup that no one intended to cook. It nourished, it refreshed, and occasionally it betrayed. But no one could live without it, so its flaws were politely ignored, because in the ancient world survival didn't wait for sanitation science to catch up. What went in upstream came back downstream with opinions, and ancient cities drank them anyway. Rainwater has always been humanity's favourite illusion. It falls from the sky looking pure, tasting clean, and behaving as though it arrived directly from heaven's personal filtration system. And to be fair, the moment it leaves the clouds, it is clean, perfect even, unsullied by earth, animal, industry, or the questionable habits of your neighbours. But then, tragedy strikes. Rainwater lands on something, and that something is usually a roof. In ancient cities, rainwater collection was a practical art. People needed water, and when the sky offered some for free, you accepted it gratefully, like a surprise rebate from the universe. But collecting rain wasn't as simple as holding out a bucket. It required infrastructure, gutters, channels, cisterns, jars, and whatever ceramic containers had not yet cracked from overuse. These systems worked beautifully in theory. In practice, rainwater had a journey to make before reaching your cup, and every step of that journey introduced complications. Let's start with the roof, the first and worst stop on the rainwater's tour. Roofs in ancient cities were rarely pristine. They were dusty, sooty, bird-frequented platforms that existed primarily as a catch-all for anything the wind or wildlife deposited there. Birds in particular treated rooftops as democratic public facilities. They left messages. They left opinions. They left things you definitely did not want flavouring your drinking water. So while rain may have fallen pure, it left the roof with a distinctly different resume. A bit earthier, a bit more seasoned, a bit more, why does this taste like disappointment? Next, the runoff travelled through gutters or channels, which were often made of clay, stone or wood. None of these materials were inherently harmful, but they were almost always dirty. Gutters collected leaves, dust, insects, small pebbles, larger pebbles, and occasionally tiny adventurous animals who misjudged the weather. When the rain came, everything flowed together into the storage container because ancient filtration systems range from minimal to non-existent. People sometimes placed cloth over jars to catch debris, but cloth could only do so much. It caught twigs and feathers, yes. It did not catch bacteria, dissolved droppings, or the mysterious roof dust that accumulated like ancient city confetti. Now onto storage, where rainwater truly developed its personality. Storage vessels came in many forms: clay jars, stone cisterns, underground reservoirs, and wooden barrels. Each had its own charm, each had its own problems. A clay jar might be porous, allowing groundwater, insects, or that one persistent worm to sneak in. A stone cistern could crack, allowing soil and sediment to mingle with the water. An underground reservoir, while cool and shaded, was also the perfect environment for algae to grow a thriving aquatic empire. A wooden barrel? Excellent, if you wanted your water to taste like tree. And none of these containers were cleaned with anything resembling modern standards. Rinsing happened when they remembered. Scrubbing happened when they had time. Disinfecting was not a concept yet, unless you count hoping really hard as a method. As a result, rainwater, despite its pure origins, often turned questionable within hours. That wasn't even the worst of it. Standing water attracts things: curious insects, opportunistic mosquitoes, thirsty rodents who decided that lids were merely strong suggestions, tiny organic visitors who fell in and were never seen again. If you were unlucky, the surface of your rainwater jar developed a thin film, the kind that raised existential questions about your life choices. People still drank it. Why? Because rainwater was, compared to everything else in the city, less bad. It hadn't flowed through the communal river sewer system. It hadn't soaked through questionable soil. It hadn't passed through a rope and bucket contraption shared by 300 unwashed hands. Rainwater was the bargain option. Not perfect, but better than the alternative. Ancient households tried to improve its quality with primitive methods. Some covered storage containers, some added charcoal at the bottom, some let water settle so sediment dropped to the bottom. Others boiled it when they had fuel and time and when the thought crossed their mind. But these improvements were inconsistent, and the resulting water still carried a hint of rooftop ambience. Even so, rainwater was precious. Entire architectural styles developed around capturing it more effectively. Courtyards were angled so water flowed inward. Roofs sloped strategically. Gutters were widened or deepened. Cities in dry regions built enormous underground cisterns that fed entire neighborhoods during droughts. In desert settlements, A single rainstorm could determine survival for months. People prayed for rain, danced for rain, sacrificed for rain, and built elaborate systems to honour the water they collected, even if it arrived carrying dust and bird commentary. The truth is that rainwater was the ancient world's cleanest, unreliable resource. It began pure, then slowly adopted the personality of whatever surface it touched, whatever container held it, and whatever small creature visited it. And yet, despite all this, it was still safer than many alternatives, because even if it fell into jars full of algae, insects, sediment, and bird-flavoured undertones, rainwater had one advantage no other source could offer. For one shining moment, before it hit the roof, it truly was clean. It falls clean from the sky. Then it meets the roof. If ancient wells were gambles and rivers were multi-purpose chaos streams, aqueducts were the ancient world's attempt at getting fancy. They were feats of engineering so impressive that modern tourists still photograph them from every angle, whispering, "Wow, the Romans really knew what they were doing." And they did, structurally, sanitarily. Let's just say the aqueducts carried water, and whatever else happened to join the journey. Aqueducts existed because Rome had one major problem. It was big. Too big to rely on a handful of wells, too congested to depend on a river that doubled as a laundromat, and too ambitious to let citizens wander around thirsty. So Rome did what Rome always did when faced with a challenge. It built something enormous and declared the problem solved. But aqueducts solved quantity, not cleanliness. These elevated stone channels transported millions of gallons of water every day from springs and mountain sources miles away. This gave Romans the illusion of purity. Mountain water sounds clean, flowing water looks clean, and water delivered by arches and gravity feels like it must be clean. Except cleanliness was not part of the engineering plan, not even briefly. Aqueducts were built open to the air for large stretches of their route, which meant everything floating in the atmosphere was invited to participate. Dust, pollen, insects, leaves, feathers, the occasional bird that misjudged its landing, and sometimes entire animals who fell in and transformed the aqueduct into a slow-moving memorial. Then there were the interior walls. Over time, minerals in the water created thick, crusty deposits. Limescale, calcium carbonate, mineral buildup, layer upon layer of it. Engineers occasionally chiseled these deposits away, but more often than not the aqueducts slowly narrowed, like arteries in need of a dietary intervention. The water still flowed, but it flowed through tunnels lined with century-old mineral plaques and whatever else had adhered to them. None of this scared the Romans. In fact, they were proud of how much water they delivered. They boasted about pressure, speed, and distance. Purity wasn't even on their bragging list. Why? Because germs had not been invented yet, at least not conceptually. If water looked clear, people trusted it. If it flowed vigorously, even better. If it came from mountains, it must be the beverage of gods. Meanwhile, microscopic organisms were doing triathlons inside the aqueduct channels, fully enjoying the ride Rome had so generously provided. Worse still, although the aqueducts began at clean sources, they didn't always stay clean once they entered the city. Urban infrastructure had layers, and some of those layers had creative modifications. In certain places, illegal pipes tapped into aqueducts so privately owned homes, bathhouses, or businesses could siphon off water. These DIY attachments were often poorly sealed, allowing dirt and runoff to leak in. Some pipes even ran through areas where animals were kept. And if you're imagining a pipe nobly transporting pure mountain water directly into a courtyard full of goats, yes, exactly that. And then there were the distribution tanks. Once the water arrived in the city, it entered large settling basins where sediment was supposed to sink. These tanks worked well at first. Then came the dirt, the algae, the decomposing debris brought in from miles away, the occasional frog who wandered in and set up shop. Cleanliness was a matter of timing. Dip your bucket early in the day, and you might get water that only contained a hint of yesterday. Dip it late, and you were drinking water that had fully marinated. Still, aqueduct water was considered premium compared to wells and rivers. It powered public baths, fountains, gardens, and wealthy households. It kept cities functioning. But premium water does not always mean clean water. The Romans, lacking microbial theory, believed impurities were visible. If you couldn't see it, it wasn't there. They had filtration systems, but these mostly removed sticks, leaves, and objects large enough to make a thud when poured out of a jar. Anything smaller than noticeable on a bad day simply passed through. This led to a fascinating paradox. Rome had some of the most advanced water systems in the ancient world, yet still suffered massive outbreaks of diseases linked to contaminated water. They built marvels of stone, arches, and hydraulic genius. But not once did anyone ask, is it possible that the shimmering, delightful water is quietly plotting against us? Engineering solved delivery. Germs enjoyed the ride. The aqueducts remain among the most iconic symbols of Roman brilliance. They were beautiful, monumental, and undeniably effective at bringing water to millions. But did they bring clean water? Not necessarily. Rome's crowning infrastructure achievement was essentially a giant city-wide water slide, delivering everything from pristine mountain droplets to whatever unfortunate bug fell in along the way. And people drank it, bathed in it, cooked with it, and proudly declared it the best water in the world. It was certainly the most consistent. Clean? That depended on your definition. Abundant? Absolutely. But as the ancient world would eventually learn, quantity isn't everything, especially when germs are having the time of their lives. If ancient water sources were unreliable, then stored water was downright treacherous. You could fetch the cleanest water available, mountain spring, fresh rain, well drawn at dawn, and feel triumphant, virtuous, and hydrated. But the moment that water entered a storage container, its personality changed. Water, as it turns out, ages badly without refrigeration. Storage was the great equalizer of the ancient world. No matter how clean your water began, once you put it in a cistern, barrel, jar, or amphora, time started working against you. And time worked quickly. Let's start with cisterns, the underground tanks used by countless cities, especially in dry regions where every drop mattered. Cisterns were carved into bedrock or constructed from stone, then coated with plaster to reduce leakage. Ingenious? Yes. Hygienic? Absolutely not. A cistern could hold thousands of gallons of water, but it also held everything that drifted, fell, crawled, blew, or washed inside. Leaves, dust, insects, mud, feathers. Nature contributed generously. City life contributed even more. Dirt from rooftops washed in, debris from streets washed in, bird droppings washed in. And because cisterns were dark, damp pits, they became condominiums for organisms that really enjoyed those conditions. Algae, for example. Algae loved cisterns. Once water sat for a while, sunlight sneaking through cracks encouraged green films to appear along the walls and surface. You didn't have to be a sanitation expert to know that water with a thin green moustache was not ideal. But when the alternative was dehydration, algae became a mildly irritating garnish rather than a deal-breaker. Then there were barrels. Barrels were widely used for both short and long-term storage. Wood was plentiful, portable, and easy to shape. It also had grains, cracks, pores, and all sorts of welcoming crevices for tiny uninvited guests. A wooden barrel could impart flavour, sometimes pleasantly earthy, sometimes, why does my water taste like a tree died twice? Barrels warped in heat, leaked in cold, and occasionally swelled so unpredictably that the lid popped off with the enthusiasm of a surprise party. But beyond flavour and structural drama, barrels had a deeper problem. They were impossible to truly clean. Without modern tools, disinfectants, or the motivational fear of bacteria, Ancient people cleaned barrels about as effectively as someone rinsing a coffee mug and calling it good. Residue accumulated. Microbes thrived. Water stored in a barrel for more than a day developed character. And then came insects. Insects loved water containers. Loved them. Mosquitoes in warm climates treated stagnant water like a maternity ward. Flies hovered around openings, fell in, and drowned with all the grace of a tragic opera. Beetles wandered in by accident. Spiders skated across the surface like tiny, ambitious athletes. And of course, ants, always ants, found water containers irresistible, marching in and out like they owned the place. Some insects died in the water, some didn't. Neither outcome improved the flavour. To make matters worse, stagnation transformed even good water into a microbial carnival. Water needs movement to stay fresh. The moment it sits still, oxygen drops, temperature rises, and a silent biochemical party begins. Ancient water didn't go bad dramatically. It didn't turn black or fizz ominously. It simply became unpleasant in ways that people couldn't see, only taste or suffer later. Mold sometimes appeared around or inside containers, especially clay ones, which absorbed moisture like thirsty sponges. Bacteria multiplied in the warm, nutrient-rich environment. Slimy films formed along the inner walls, sediment settled at the bottom, collecting into mysterious layers no one ever wanted to stir. But storage wasn't optional. People needed water ready for use, especially in urban homes where fetching it repeatedly was exhausting and time-consuming. So they stored it, hoping that darkness, lids, cloth covers and wishful thinking would keep it safe. Wealthier households sometimes used ceramic jars, glazed intentionally to reduce absorption, but glazes cracked, jars chipped, and once damaged, the container introduced new crevices where water could degrade faster. Even the fanciest villa had at least one jar of water that tasted like a secret. Public storage wasn't much better. Cities often kept communal cisterns for emergencies or dry seasons. These cisterns were rarely cleaned. In fact, cleaning a public cistern was so difficult that many communities simply waited for sediment to build up enough to reduce capacity, and then dug a new one. This meant the oldest cisterns were the most flavourful, and yet, water storage was a miracle of survival. It allowed families to drink during droughts, cook without constant trips to wells, and preserve the little stability they had. It may have been imperfect, but it was necessary. Ancient people accepted that stored water changed over time. If it smelled odd, you let it breathe. If it tasted earthy, you shrugged. If something floated in it, well, you removed it and kept drinking. Thirst lowered standards with astonishing speed, because clean water didn't stay clean, not in a cistern, not in a barrel, not in a jar. In the ancient world, the moment water left its source, the clock started ticking, and the transformation from refreshing to suspect could happen faster than anyone expected. Water ages badly without refrigeration, but ancient cities drank it anyway, because the only thing more dangerous than stored water was having none at all. In the ancient world, water was never a private experience. You didn't get to pour yourself a glass, savour its clarity, and reflect on your life choices in peaceful isolation. No, when you approached a watering spot, you joined a crowd, and not just a crowd of people, a crowd of everything. Humans weren't the only ones who needed water to survive. Livestock needed it. Working animals needed it. Stray animals needed it. Wild animals wandered into cities and needed it. Sometimes even the occasional runaway chicken or particularly determined goat felt entitled to a sip. And because ancient cities lacked fences, barriers, and anything resembling modern zoning laws, animals often drank from the same basins, troughs, pools, well sides, or runoff channels as humans. Congratulations, you're sharing a drink with a donkey. It wasn't intentional, of course. Ancient people did not prefer to hydrate shoulder to shoulder with livestock, but practicality overruled preference. Water points were limited, infrastructure was minimal, and the line between this is the people's water source, and this is the animal's water source, was blurry, flexible, and often non-existent. Let's begin with livestock watering points, the communal troughs, basins, and carved stone depressions placed around cities. These were essential. Horses, cattle, sheep, goats, and donkeys kept the economy running. They transported goods, ploughed fields, gave milk, or became dinner. Keeping them hydrated was not negotiable. A typical watering point saw a parade of hooves, snouts, beaks, and noses throughout the day. Animals stepped in the water. They sneezed in the water. They dripped saliva into the water with the unrestrained enthusiasm of creatures who had never heard of hygiene. Sometimes they defecated near it, or in it. And because no one was about to waste water, humans still filled their own jugs from the same source, often after gently shooing a donkey aside. You didn't drink alone. You drank after everyone else. Then there were shared basins, those charming multi-purpose features placed in courtyards or near public spaces. People used them to wash hands, splash faces, rinse vegetables, cool down, or soak tools. Animals, however, viewed these basins as personal buffets of hydration. A cow wandering by might lower its enormous unwashed head right into the water you were planning to drink. A goat might perch its front hooves on the rim for easier slurping. Dogs lapped enthusiastically. Cats treated the basin as their special spa. Even birds joined in. Pigeons perched on the edge, taking delicate sips, sometimes falling in, sometimes contributing. Comments. Cross-contamination wasn't a possibility. It was a guarantee. Ancient people weren't oblivious to this. They knew animals brought dirt, hair, and mystery substances into water. They were fully aware that drinking from a goat's favourite puddle was not ideal. But what choice did they have? Water was limited. You couldn't build a separate trough for every species without turning the city into a plumbing labyrinth. And animals didn't follow rules. Tell a donkey to drink somewhere else, and it would stare at you with deep, existential defiance, and continue drinking. Even the more advanced societies like Rome or parts of Mesopotamia struggled with separation. You could create aqueduct-fed fountains for citizens, yes, but animals gathered near them too. Troughs placed nearby overflowed, and that overflow mixed with runoff from the streets, forming shallow puddles where smaller animals drank while larger animals wandered between them with no regard for human complaints. And let's talk about markets, where things were particularly lively. Market squares bustled with people buying and selling goods, but they also hosted herds of animals awaiting trade or slaughter. These animals needed water, meaning that any nearby fountain, basin, or well area became an impromptu cattle watering station. Water splashed, spilled, and pooled. People filled their jugs while stepping around hooves. Chickens strutted through puddles. Dogs sniffed the edges. At least one goose somewhere honked aggressively at anyone who approached its water. Meanwhile, all these animals shed hair, skin flakes, feathers, saliva, and other contributions into the environment. When the next rainstorm arrived, these contributions washed downhill, right back into the nearest human-accessible water point. Even in private homes, animals intruded. Wealthier households kept livestock nearby. Pigs in courtyards, chickens on rooftops, goats tied beside workshops. Servants drew water from shared household cisterns, which were conveniently accessible, and also convenient for any household animal that spotted an opportunity. You haven't lived until you've seen a thirsty goat knock over a jar. Humans weren't innocent either. People washed hands, tools, wounds, and produce at the same sources. Children played in the water. Adults spit into it. Bathers rinsed off. After all, if the donkey didn't care, why should anyone else? This co-usage blurred the boundary between drinking water and water that has seen things. Ancient cities simply didn't have the infrastructure to enforce clean, separated systems. Water was water. Whoever needed it, took it, human or animal. This created a perfect recipe for cross-contamination. Not that anyone recognized it as such. If someone fell ill, the water was rarely blamed. People blamed heat, fatigue, diet, spirits, weather, or divine disfavour. No one suspected that the same basin visited by livestock all morning had helped. Still, people continued using these communal water points because the alternative was impractical. You couldn't deny animals access. You couldn't fetch water miles away every day. You couldn't build private systems for every household. So you drank the water. You shared it with goats, cows, donkeys, birds, dogs, cats, and whatever else wandered by. And somehow, the ancient world kept going, powered by people who spent their entire lives hydrating from basins that doubled as animal buffets. Congratulations, you're sharing a drink with a donkey. Boiling water is one of humanity's simplest and most effective defences against contaminated water. Heat kills pathogens, parasites, and most of the unpleasant microscopic hitchhikers that ancient cities unknowingly swallowed every day. You would think, therefore, that boiling water would have been the ancient world's go-to strategy, a universal habit, a routine as common as grinding grain or complaining about taxes. But no, boiling water was absolutely known, yet almost never used. Not because ancient people rejected safety, not because they enjoyed gastrointestinal roulette, but because boiling water required three things the ancient world never had enough of: fuel, time, and a reason to believe it mattered. Let's start with the biggest obstacle. Fuel was expensive. Firewood was a precious commodity in ancient cities. It heated homes in winter, powered kitchens year-round, fueled blacksmiths' forges, baked pottery, processed metal, dried grain, and kept bathhouses running. A family might spend a significant portion of its income just acquiring enough wood or charcoal for daily needs. No one looked at their diminishing wood pile and thought, "Ah, yes, time to waste some on making water," slightly less suspicious. Firewood was heavy, bulky, and required constant resupply. Unless you lived near a forest, most major cities didn't, wood had to be transported by cart or animal, which meant more labour, more cost, and more risk. Charcoal, though more efficient, was pricier still. So boiling water wasn't an inconvenience, it was a luxury. Burning wood just to heat water seemed as extravagant as burning coins. Next, there was the issue of time. Boiling water was slow, painfully slow. If you needed water immediately, which was often, waiting for a pot to heat, boil, cool, and then be safe enough to drink felt unreasonable when you were thirsty, busy, overworked, or carrying jars for an entire household. Even if you had the fuel and the pot, you also needed the patience. Ancient life was labour-intensive. People spent hours grinding flour, hauling water, tending fires, working fields, weaving, cooking, and bargaining in markets. Boiling water was an extra chore tacked onto a schedule already packed with tasks that directly affected survival. And worst of all, boiled water tasted odd, flat, lifeless, like water that had been through something emotionally difficult. When overworked people face a choice between drink water now or spend 40 minutes making it taste slightly worse, the choice tends to be obvious. But the largest barrier of all was ignorance, completely understandable ignorance. Ancient people had no concept of germs, pathogens, or microscopic life. Water could look clear, taste refreshing, smell perfectly normal, and still be full of threats invisible to the naked eye. To ancient logic, if water wasn't slimy, murky, or foul-smelling, it was fine. And if drinking it sometimes caused illness, well, plenty of other things caused illness too. Bad air, bad weather, bad omens. Definitely not bad water. This meant the idea of boiling water just in case made no sense. Why waste fuel and time when the water looked clean? Boiling was something you did for cooking, preparing herbal medicines or softening ingredients, not for drinking. It was a step with a purpose, not a health precaution. Even cultures that understood boiling could make water safer still didn't use it consistently. Ancient Chinese texts mention the practice. Some Middle Eastern physicians recommended it. The Romans used heated water for medicinal broths. But even in these places, boiling was not a routine, only an occasional tactic. Then there were social perceptions. Boiled water was associated with the sick. Boiling your drinking water might signal you were frail, unwell, or recovering from something unpleasant. Healthy people drank cold or room temperature water. To boil your water daily would have been like wearing a bandage forever. Practical perhaps, but socially confusing. And let's not forget vessel limitations. Pottery cracked under sudden heat changes. Bronze pots were expensive. Iron pots rusted if neglected. Not every household had a vessel suitable for constant boiling, especially among the poor. Even if they did, keeping that vessel clean enough to avoid recontaminating the boiled water was an art form few mastered. But perhaps the most compelling reason boiling wasn't universal is the simplest. People lived this way for generations, and most survived long enough to raise children. If disaster didn't strike every time they drank unboiled water, then clearly nothing was wrong. So boiling remained a background option, a method known but mostly unused, not because it was ineffective, but because the ancient world lacked the framework to understand its benefits. You could boil the water, you truly could, or you could drink it now and hope usually won because water was urgent, fuel was scarce, life was exhausting, and invisible danger was not yet part of anyone's worldview. Boiling was the solution humanity had, but rarely bothered to use. If the ancient world had a slogan, it wouldn't be "live, laugh, love." It would be something closer to sobriety was optional, hydration was not. Because when clean water was unreliable, unpredictable, or just plain terrifying, people turned to the one beverage category that consistently didn't make them sick: fermented drinks. Beer, wine, mead, weak ale, sour wine, call them what you like, but they were the ancient world's most dependable liquid companions. Not because people wanted to be tipsy all day, though some did, but because fermentation accidentally solved a problem humanity didn't know it had: microorganisms. Fermentation is a marvelous process. Yeasts eat sugars, release alcohol, produce acidity, and create an environment where many dangerous pathogens simply cannot survive. Ancient people didn't know the chemistry behind it, but they absolutely noticed the results. You could drink beer or wine without spending 3 days regretting your life choices. Water was a gamble, alcohol was a safety plan. So let's break down why fermented drinks became the unofficial hydration system of entire civilizations. 1. Alcohol kills or weakens pathogens without anyone realizing it. Ancient people didn't know what bacteria were, but they did know that beer didn't send you to the healer nearly as often as river water did. They saw patterns. People who drank weak beer daily stayed healthier than those who drank straight water. They didn't need microscopes to understand cause and effect. They simply trusted their digestive tracts, which were very vocal about which liquids they preferred. Even low alcohol percentages, 1%, 2%, sometimes barely more, made a difference. Add in the acidity, the boiling step used during brewing, and the reduced oxygen environment, and suddenly you had a beverage that unintentionally crushed threats water carried happily. Beer wasn't just a drink, it was medicine. Accidental, delicious medicine. 2. Brewing required boiling, without calling it, boiling water for safety. Remember how ancient people didn't like boiling water because it wasted fuel and time? Brewing cleverly hid the boiling step inside a tasty product. To make beer or ale, grain mash had to be heated. Heating killed bacteria. Yeast then outcompeted remaining microbes. By the time the beverage reached someone's cup, it had already gone through a sanitation process disguised as making breakfast stronger. Even wine, made without boiling, produced alcohol and acids inhospitable to many waterborne pathogens. Wine diluted with water, a common practice, actually made the water safer than drinking it plain. So when ancient people drank alcohol, they weren't just having a good time, they were unknowingly conducting public health miracles. 3. Weak alcohol. Was a daily beverage, not a party drink, forget modern assumptions. Ancient beer was not a 12% craft IPA designed to knock you sideways. It was low alcohol, cloudy, porridge-like, and had the consistency of something between broth and oatmeal. Wine too was often diluted, sometimes by half, sometimes by 3/4. People didn't drink to get drunk, they drank to stay alive. Families drank it. Children drank it. Workers drank it before labouring in the fields. Servants drank it while serving feasts. Monks brewed it. Farmers fermented it. Cities depended on it. If water was suspicious, beer was trustworthy. If water was unpredictable, wine was consistent. Choosing water over beer was noble, but unnecessary. 4. Alcohol, extended shelf life. Far better than stored. Stored water became a microbial swamp after a few days. Fermented drinks, however, stayed stable for weeks or months. Even when they soured, they remained drinkable, just more acidic, not more deadly. Ancient households couldn't refrigerate anything, so shelf stability was everything. A jug of water went bad quickly. A jug of beer, practically eternal. Well, not eternal, but long enough for ancient people to forget when they brewed it. 5. Fermented drinks were part of the economy and a cultural identity. Beer built civilizations. Mesopotamians paid wages in beer. Egyptians offered beer to gods and pharaohs alike. Greeks diluted wine into a daily staple. Romans mixed wine with herbs, spices, or even salt to stretch it. Medieval people drank small beer all day because the water in towns simply could not be trusted. To drink alcohol wasn't indulgence, it was common sense. The poor drank weak ale, the wealthy drank wine. Monks perfected brewing. No class, profession, or region fully escaped the gravitational pull of fermented beverages. Alcohol was embedded in ritual, diet, medicine, trade, and daily life. And all of this happened because water, humanity's oldest friend, could not be trusted to behave. 6. Fermented drinks were a controlled environment, unlike everything else. Water came from wells, rivers, rain, or storage. Fermentation came from human hands. It was a rare example of people controlling a natural process rather than suffering from it. By brewing, humans took an unpredictable resource and gave it rules. Heat it, cool it, add yeast, let it bubble, strain it, drink without fear. Even if people didn't understand why it worked, they knew it did. In the end, alcohol wasn't recreation. It was hydration strategy. When your water supply is shared with livestock runoff, buckets that have seen trauma, and rivers doubling as sewage highways, a fermented drink becomes the rational choice. Sobriety was optional, hydration was not. And so, across thousands of years and countless civilizations, people solved the problem of unsafe water not through filtration, sanitation, or public health policy, but through yeast. In every ancient city, no matter how grand its temples, how bustling its markets, or how impressive its engineering, one truth shadowed daily life. Children were the most fragile members of society, and contaminated water targeted them first. This was not a rare tragedy. It was a constant one. Families expected loss. Communities absorbed it. And water, the very thing that sustained life, was often the quiet agent behind so many early deaths. Infant mortality rates in the ancient world were staggering by modern standards. 1/3 of children might die before their first birthday. Many more would not survive to age 5. These numbers weren't caused solely by disease, poor nutrition, or harsh environments, though those all played roles. A significant portion of these deaths came from something tragically simple: unsafe fluids entering tiny, vulnerable bodies. Infants, of course, were not drinking river water or dipping cups into communal basins. They were supposed to be protected by breastfeeding, a remarkably effective natural defense. Breast milk was clean, nourishing, antibacterial, and packed with immune-supporting compounds. It shielded infants from pathogens that ravaged adults. It offered hydration without risk, and it required no storage, no boiling, no container that could harbour contamination. But breastfeeding did not always continue long enough. Mothers faced exhaustion, illness, malnutrition, and overwhelming workloads. Some could not breastfeed. Some didn't produce enough milk. Some needed to return to labour quickly. Cultural practices also varied. In certain households, breastfeeding was seen as a task for wet nurses. Wealthier families often handed infants to servants, believing this freed mothers from physical strain. But in reality, it introduced new points of vulnerability. Wet nurses could be malnourished themselves, or feeding multiple children, diluting the protective effects of breastfeeding. And when milk was insufficient, families turned to alternatives: animal milk, grain-based gruels, or mixtures of milk and water intended to stretch limited supplies. This was where danger entered decisively. Animal milk, while nourishing, was rarely clean. It spoiled quickly in heat. It carried its own bacterial risks, and the moment caregivers added water to thin the milk, believing they were helping the infant digest it, they unknowingly introduced the full spectrum of urban contamination. A baby's immune system, undeveloped and fragile, could not withstand even a fraction of what an adult's stomach endured daily. Waterborne pathogens that an adult might fight off with a week of weakness could end an infant's life in hours or days. Weaning, which should have been a gradual and hopeful transition, became one of the most dangerous milestones in a child's early years. Across cultures, the moment solid foods and supplementary liquids were introduced, mortality rates spiked. Not because parents were careless, they were doing what they believed best. But the foods they prepared often required water. The bowls and utensils weren't sterile. The grain porridge might be mixed with liquid from a cistern or well, or even diluted beer or wine, practices meant to aid digestion, not endanger it. Even boiled grains, once cooled, could attract bacteria faster than anyone realized. Stored foods fermented at unpredictable rates. Homes lacked the controlled temperatures necessary to keep weaning mixtures safe. Every meal prepared for a child was a gamble, not by choice, but by circumstance. Then there were illnesses like diarrhea, dangerous for adults, but catastrophic for infants. What adults considered an inconvenience was, for children, a sudden and severe loss of fluids and electrolytes. Rehydration required clean water, which was rarely available. Rehydrating with contaminated water could worsen the illness. Families watched helplessly as children weakened, not understanding the cause, not knowing how to break the cycle. Communities recognized the patterns, even if they didn't understand the mechanisms. Older women advised prolonged breastfeeding whenever possible. Some cultures delayed weaning far longer than others, believing, correctly though they didn't know why, that children died less frequently when they remained on breast milk longer. Others developed rituals or protective practices around first foods, not realizing these customs reflected generations of observation about survival, not symbolism. Yet even with these cultural adaptations, mortality remained high. The poorest families, lacking resources, were hit hardest. They had the least fuel for boiling water, the least access to fresh milk, the most crowded homes, and the most exposure to contamination from communal water sources. Their children were the most vulnerable to every environmental hazard. There is no humour here. There is no historical distance that softens this reality. In ancient cities, children died first because their bodies were unprepared for a world where water could not be trusted. Families loved their children no less fiercely than modern parents do. They mourned deeply. They grieved with the same aching questions. But they lived in an environment where survival was precarious, biology was unforgiving, and water, essential, unavoidable water, carried risks no one yet understood. This chapter doesn't end with a witty punchline, because the ancient world didn't get one. Childhood was fragile, life was uncertain, and the smallest, most innocent members of society bore the heaviest burden of a world still learning how to keep its water safe. In the modern world, diarrhea is a dramatic interruption to your day, an unpleasant surprise, a medical concern, or at the very least an unplanned workout for your plumbing. In the ancient world, however, diarrhea wasn't an event. It wasn't even a symptom. It was a lifestyle, a phase of existence so common that people barely paused to acknowledge it unless someone was truly bedridden. For many ancient city dwellers, the digestive system was less a reliable engine and more a chaotic roommate who ignored boundaries and made decisions without consulting anyone. Chronic gastrointestinal distress was so widespread, so predictable, and so normalized that a person with perfectly stable digestion would have been seen not as healthy but as suspiciously blessed. If digestion was stable, something was wrong. This wasn't because ancient people had inherently weaker stomachs. Quite the opposite. Through constant exposure, their bodies were conditioned to tolerate microbial chaos that would send a modern traveller to the emergency room. The problem wasn't the people. The problem was everything they put into their bodies. Water, of course, was a major culprit. Contaminated sources delivered a steady rotation of bacteria, parasites, and gut-wrecking surprises. But food played its part as well. Produce washed in questionable water, meat cooked quickly over inconsistent fires, grains stored in damp environments, dairy consumed with a confidence that modern refrigerators would find reckless. All contributed to a digestive landscape that rarely enjoyed a peaceful day. Ancient diets were full of heavy breads, dense porridges, salted fish, dried meats, and street foods prepared under creative hygiene standards. Add to that the use of communal eating spaces, shared utensils, and cooking in overcrowded quarters, and you have a digestive system constantly negotiating peace treaties with unfamiliar microbes. Bowels did not rest. They did not relax. They did not enjoy stability. Instead, they cycled through phases of discomfort, urgency, grudging cooperation, and rebellion. A person might have loose bowels for a week, stabilize for a day or two, and then be thrown back into turmoil by the next cup of river water diluted wine, or the next stew that simmered just short of killing all the microbes. It wasn't considered an emergency. It was considered Tuesday. People worked through it. Soldiers marched through it. Labourers hauled water while experiencing the consequences of the previous day's water. Merchants, priests, farmers, scribes, everyone lived with some degree of digestive unpredictability. Chronic diarrhea was so common that it barely qualified as a condition. Medical texts mention it, but usually as a symptom of something far more dramatic. On its own, loose stools didn't merit alarm. They were expected. Ancient physicians tried to treat severe digestive issues, but the advice was often contradictory. Some recommended fasting, others recommended heavy meals, some suggested wine, others suggested avoiding wine, some blamed bile, others blamed phlegm, and everyone blamed something different when the patient didn't get better. Yet most people didn't seek treatment at all. For mild or moderate diarrhea, the assumption wasn't "I am sick." It was, "I drank the usual water, ate the usual food, and this is the usual outcome." When everything you consumed was a gamble, your intestines simply learned to operate in crisis mode. Parasites also played a starring role in this digestive drama. Worms were so common that they appeared in medical writings, folk stories, household remedies, and even religious texts. Children carried them. Adults carried them. Entire communities carried them. These unwelcome guests disrupted digestion, stole nutrients, and ensured instability remained the norm. Add to this the reality of poor sanitation, latrines placed near living quarters, waste pits that overflowed in rain, chamber pots emptied into streets, animals wandering freely, and you begin to understand why the gastrointestinal system struggled to maintain peace. Ancient cities were loud, crowded, vibrant, and biologically overwhelming. Your body was constantly exposed to new microbial challenges, and your intestines responded with the enthusiasm of an overworked bureaucrat stamping paperwork at high speed. And yet people endured. They went to work, they cared for families, They lived entire lives with bowels that would horrify modern digestive specialists. It's important to emphasize that chronic gastrointestinal distress didn't mean ancient people were constantly incapacitated. Human bodies adapt in extraordinary ways. Over time, many people developed a tolerance, or at least a resignation, to the digestive havoc. Their symptoms became background noise, a discomfort woven into the fabric of daily life. To us, diarrhea is a problem. To them, it was a phase, long, recurring and inconvenient, but rarely shocking. This wasn't resilience in the heroic sense. It was resilience born of necessity. When every sip of water, every cup of weak beer, every bite of food carried risk, the digestive system simply had no chance to rest. In a world without sanitation, refrigeration, or knowledge of microbes, digestive chaos wasn't a crisis. It was a constant. A reminder that survival wasn't clean, comfortable, or predictable. And so, in the ancient city, people didn't ask, "Why is my stomach acting like this?" They asked, "When will it calm down this time?" If digestion was stable, something was wrong, because stability was the one thing ancient water never offered. For most people in ancient cities, everyday digestive misery was a background nuisance, unpleasant, constant, but survivable. But every so often, the water didn't just make you uncomfortable, it turned on the entire city at once. Chronic gastrointestinal chaos became something far worse, a sudden explosive outbreak of cholera-like or dysentery-like diseases that devastated populations with terrifying speed. These weren't gentle illnesses. They were city-wide speedruns of collapse, waterborne disasters that bypassed slow-burning symptoms and went straight for the jugular, often within hours. And the worst part? No ancient city understood what caused them. All they knew was that one day the streets were bustling, and the next they were emptying. Because when epidemic waterborne disease arrived, the city didn't panic. It emptied. 1. Quiet water. Sudden disaster. Outbreaks often started innocently. Someone drew water from a well that tasted slightly off. Someone else drank from a river after a heavy rainstorm. A storage cistern, calm, still, deceptively clear, happened to contain a microbial stew no one could detect. One contaminated source was all it took. People drank, and the disease began its sprint. Unlike chronic everyday digestive issues which simmered quietly, epidemic pathogens struck with brutal force. They bypassed slow incubation and got straight to work, stripping the body of fluids with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. Victims weakened rapidly, sometimes in a single day. The symptoms were unmistakable: unstoppable diarrhea, violent cramps, vomiting, rapid dehydration, confusion, collapse. These illnesses didn't merely inconvenience the city, they drained it, literally and metaphorically. Within 24 hours, a healthy person could be reduced to frailty. Within 48 hours, they could be gone. In a world without rehydration therapy, antibiotics, or understanding of microbes, the body simply could not replace fluids fast enough, especially not with the same contaminated water that caused the illness. 2. Cities were perfect ecosystems. For epidemics, ancient cities were dense, crowded, and highly interconnected. The very things that made city life efficient, shared wells, public fountains, market stalls, bathhouses, became highways for disease. A single infected water source could reach every household that drew from the well, every market vendor who rinsed, produce every cook who used that water in stew, every child who drank from the fountain, every traveller stopping to refresh their jar. Contamination moved like lightning, because daily survival required constant drinking. Unlike food, which people could skip, water was unavoidable. And unlike mild pathogens, which took days to circulate, cholera-like and dysentery-like agents could spread through the entire population before anyone recognized a pattern. One afternoon, the city hummed with normal life. By the end of the week, a fifth of its population might be too weak to work. By the end of 2, the city was quiet, not peaceful, emptied. 3. No germ theory, no chance to modernise. The cause seems obvious: dirty water. But in the ancient world, people had no concept of microscopic life. They saw symptoms without context. They saw patterns but misunderstood them. They invented explanations because silence was unbearable. Some blamed the heat. Some blamed spirits. Some blamed corrupted air. Some blamed the alignment of the stars. No one blamed the water, because water looked the same as it always had. Physicians, armed with humoral theory, attempted treatments. Bloodletting, purgatives, herbal mixtures. None addressed the cause. Many accelerated dehydration. Even more tragically, families caring for the sick often became infected themselves, not through sympathy or proximity, but through the water they shared. 4. Infrastructure amplified the crisis. The very systems meant to protect people could amplify catastrophe. Wells could become contaminated if runoff carried waste into their opening. Once tainted, the entire neighbourhood suffered. Cisterns, massive stores of still water, became reservoirs of disease, holding pathogens long after a storm or waste event introduced them. Rivers, which connected multiple settlements, could spread outbreaks downstream like a deadly relay race. Bathhouses and public fountains, symbols of sophistication, were perfect transmission hubs. One contaminated supply tank sent disease to everyone seeking refreshment. Even aqueducts, those marvels of engineering, were helpless once pathogens entered the system. Ancient cities were proud of their water networks. They didn't realize those networks could also be accelerators. 5. Social and economic collapse. Came quickly. When half the labour force is sick within days, cities shut down fast, markets closed, granaries became inaccessible, workshops fell silent, night watch patrols thinned, roads emptied, families barricaded themselves indoors, not to prevent disease they didn't understand, but to survive the absence of functioning society. Burial teams were overwhelmed. Priests offered frantic rituals. Leaders fled or issued decrees that solved nothing. And through it all, the water flowed unchanged. The same river glided past the city walls, innocent in appearance. The same well gate creaked open. The same jars sat in the same basins. Nothing looked different. Everything was different. The city didn't panic. It emptied. 6. Survivors crawled out of the silence outbreaks, eventually burned out, through exhaustion of victims or abandonment of contaminated sources. Survivors emerged thin, shaken, and confused, but determined to rebuild routines. But even then, no one fully understood the cause. No long-term infrastructural changes occurred. No sanitation reforms were invented. Life simply resumed. People returned to the same water sources because what else could they do? The cycle of vulnerability remained, ready to strike again when the right season, storm, or accident aligned. Epidemic waterborne disease was the ancient world's most efficient destroyer, not because it was mysterious, not because it was dramatic, but because it exploited the city's greatest necessity. Water gave life. Water took it away. And ancient cities had no tools, no knowledge, and no defences to stop it. If you wandered through the grand cities of the ancient world, Rome with its sprawling thermae, Greece with its gymnasia, or even smaller towns with modest communal bathhouses, you might think people had cracked the code of hygiene. Bathhouses were bustling social hubs, architectural marvels, and the ancient world's favourite excuse to not do work for several hours. You could scrub, soak, sweat, steam, gossip, and emerge feeling reborn. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Being clean on the outside had absolutely nothing to do with being safe on the inside. Ancient bathing culture was advanced, even luxurious in some regions. But drinking water safety, that remained a disaster. And bathhouses, despite their warm pools, polished tiles, and echoing grandeur, did nothing to prevent the epidemics, gastrointestinal misery, or waterborne chaos that terrorized ancient populations. You could step out of the bath shining like a marble statue, smelling like oil and virtue, but if you drank the wrong water that evening, none of that cleanliness mattered. You're clean on the outside. The danger is internal. 1. Bathing was about social life, not sanitation. Science bathhouses weren't built to make people healthier. They were built to make people civilized. They were places to relax, network, negotiate business, enjoy entertainment, and pretend your life was more luxurious than it really was. Cleanliness was a pleasant side effect, but it wasn't the goal. In Rome, a bath complex might have heated pools, cold plunges, saunas, masseurs, barbers, reading rooms, snack vendors, musicians, and exercise courtyards. It was self-care, ancient style. But none of this addressed the quality of drinking water, because no one linked dirty water to deadly disease. People washed to remove sweat, grime, and street dust, not invisible creatures they didn't know existed. They believed dirt on the skin made you uncomfortable. They did not believe dirt in the water could kill you. 2. Bath water was heated, not purified. Many modern readers assume that because water in bathhouses was warm, it must have been safer. But heating water isn't the same as boiling it. Bathhouse pools were rarely brought anywhere near boiling temperature. They were heated just enough to feel pleasant, not enough to kill pathogens. And even if they had been boiled at first, bathhouse water was constantly reused, refilled, splashed, sweated into, and sometimes accidentally swallowed. Romans wrote about bathhouse water with glowing admiration. Modern microbiologists would faint. Heating water made it relaxing. It did not make it clean. 3. The baths themselves could become microbial party hubs. Bathhouses collected thousands of visitors a day. People of all ages, classes, occupations, and health conditions soaked in the same water. Cuts, sores, and infections mingled. Dirt from bodies, oils from skin, and residues from massage treatments all drifted into the pools. The caldarium, hot room, accelerated bacterial growth. The tepidarium, warm room, sustained it. The frigidarium, cold room, preserved it. If you stayed too long, your pores felt amazing, but your immune system was probably negotiating treaties with unfamiliar organisms. Bathhouses did not spread cholera-like diseases. Those required ingestion. But they didn't prevent them either, because bathing didn't solve the root issue. The water you drank, cooked with, and fed your family wasn't clean just because you were. 4. Bath culture created a dangerous illusion of health. People believed cleanliness came from washing. They believed disease came from foul smells, bad air, or imbalances of humours. So when bathhouses made them feel refreshed and purified, they assumed their overall health was protected. This illusion was powerful. A Roman stepping out of a steam room felt invincible, like they had removed the grime of the day, and with it any lurking illness. They did not understand that the cup of water waiting for them at dinner was far more dangerous than anything floating in a warm pool. You could scrub your skin raw with a strigil. You could soak in scented oils until you achieved godlike smoothness. You could sit in the hot room long enough to question your life choices, and still, a single sip of contaminated water could defeat all your efforts. 5. Bathhouses required clean water, but didn't provide clean drinking. Water bathhouses used enormous quantities of water, far more than cities naturally supplied. They relied on aqueducts, wells, or cisterns to keep their pools full. But the water that flowed into the baths was no different from the water people cooked with or drank. It might have arrived earlier in the day, it might have been clearer, it might have been filtered for debris, but it was not purified, not disinfected, not safe in any modern sense. The bathhouse was a consumer, not a purifier. 6. Bathing culture. Sometimes made things worse. Clean skin is good. False confidence is deadly. When people bathed frequently, they assumed their bodies were healthy because they looked healthy. This false sense of security prevented them from suspecting water sources as vectors of disease. No one asked whether the well was contaminated, they asked whether the air smelled off. No one questioned whether runoff entered a cistern, they questioned whether the stars were aligned. The city could shine with marble, host grand bathhouses, and smell of perfumed oils, while its water quietly circulated sickness through every neighborhood. People were polished. Their intestines were not. Baths changed everything, except the water that mattered. Bathhouses elevated comfort, culture, beauty, and ritual. They created shared spaces, promoted grooming, and made ancient cities feel sophisticated. But they did nothing to protect people from waterborne disease, nothing to make drinking water cleaner, nothing to stop outbreaks. You could leave a bathhouse glistening like a sculpture, refreshed and radiant. But when you raised your next cup of water, the real danger wasn't on your skin. You're clean on the outside. The danger is internal. In the ancient world, people didn't judge water by what was in it. They judged it by what it smelled like. And this was a catastrophic system of evaluation, because the human nose, while excellent at finding food and detecting whether someone bathed this month, is absolutely terrible at identifying microscopic death. But for thousands of years, smell was the gold standard. If it didn't smell deadly, it wasn't. This logic rested on the widely accepted belief system known today as miasma theory. The idea that diseases were caused by foul, putrid air, rotting matter, sewage, swamps, and anything that offended the senses were thought to generate bad airs that seeped into the body and caused illness. If you inhaled stench, you inhaled sickness. So naturally people assumed clean-smelling water was safe, because if something could kill you, surely it would announce its intentions through scent. Unfortunately, microbes never got that memo. 1. Miasma. Theory made perfect sense. If you lived before microscopes. To be fair, miasma wasn't completely unreasonable. Many foul-smelling places, latrines, swampy ditches, rotting heaps of waste, did correlate with disease. The theory wasn't wrong in spirit. It just misunderstood the mechanism. People noticed patterns. Bad smells, more sickness. Good smells, less sickness. Perfumes, must be healthy flowers. Safe stagnant marsh, run immediately. So when water smelled fine, clear, or mildly earthy, people relaxed. Their noses told them everything was okay, and the nose was their most trusted tool long before science entered the chat. The flaw? Some of the deadliest pathogens on Earth have no smell at all. Cholera doesn't stink. Dysentery doesn't announce itself with an odour. Parasites don't wave from the water's surface. A cup of lethal water could smell as innocent as mountain air. 2. Ancient cities. Use scent as quality control. For everything, odour wasn't just a water test. It was a world view. Food was judged by scent. Air was judged by scent. Environments were judged by scent. Even people were judged by scent, which explains the popularity of oils, incense, and in emergencies, overwhelming perfume. The idea that something invisible and scentless could cause illness was unthinkable. If you couldn't see it, hear it, or smell it, it simply did not exist. This led to baffling contradictions. For example, people avoided swampy, foul-smelling water. Smart, good instinct. But they happily drank water that had passed through animal waste, contaminated wells, algae-filled cisterns, and upstream sewage, so long as the water lacked any dramatic odour. If the river smelled fresh, it was fresh. If the well smelled normal, it was safe. If the cup smelled fine, bottoms up. 3. Engineers tried to fix what the nose could detect. The Romans, famous for their aqueducts and engineering prowess, often redirected water sources not because they were unsafe, but because they were smelly. If an aqueduct's intake area developed an odour, perhaps from decaying vegetation or nearby animal pens, officials sometimes rerouted it. Bad smell, bad water, no smell. Perfectly fine. Carry on. But water quality isn't a fragrance issue. A pathogen doesn't decide, I'll warn them by smelling atrocious. It simply multiplies quietly. Thus, entire populations trusted water that looked lovely and smelled neutral, while avoiding water that merely offended their noses, even if it was microbiologically safer. 4. The nose cannot detect chemical or microbial reality. Imagine an ancient resident approaching the city well. The water is clear. The buckets look normal. There is no odour. Approval granted. Meanwhile, the same water might contain animal fecal bacteria, protozoan parasites, viral contaminants, runoff from recent rains, a decaying frog somewhere at the bottom. None of these have a signature scent that screams, "Please stop." The result? A household might proudly choose well water over river water because it smells cleaner, unaware that the well had recently become a microbial vacation resort. 5. Smell gave a false sense of security. During outbreaks. During deadly epidemics, cholera-like explosions, dysentery waves, people didn't flee water sources that looked and smelled fine. They fled foul air, marsh gases, garbage piles, and smoky districts. Meanwhile, the very thing killing them ran silently through their cups. When entire neighborhoods fell ill, miasma theory made people ask, "Where is the poison vapor coming from?" instead of, "What are we drinking?" No one quarantined wells. No one inspected cisterns. No one questioned fountains. Instead, they burned incense, moved sick people to breezier rooms, or relocated households away from bad air pockets. The disease continued, scentless and amused. 6. Miasma theory persisted. Because sometimes it appeared correct. Ironically, miasma theory wasn't entirely wrong. Rotting garbage and sewage pits did correlate with outbreaks, but not because the smells were harmful. They were simply markers of contamination. A swamp smelled bad because bacteria flourished there, so people assumed the smell was the danger, not the bacteria. Thus, they fixed the part they could detect: smell. Cities invested in drainage, sewer systems, waste removal, perfumed oils, incense, and architectural ventilation, not purification of water sources. They eliminated odours but not causes. It was hygienic theatre. In the end, the nose was a terrible guardian. The ancient world trusted scent the way modern people trust labels. Smell was the universal safety test, the intuitive guide, the environmental truth-teller, and for most things, food spoilage, fire, mould, it worked reasonably well. But not for water. Water didn't broadcast its dangers. It didn't smell deadly. So people drank it, cooked with it, bathed infants in it, shared it with animals, stored it in questionable containers, and trusted it because their noses approved. And whenever a disease outbreak swept through the city, no one suspected the real culprit because the water still smelled innocent. If it didn't smell deadly, it wasn't. At least, that's what everyone believed, right up until the moment it killed them. Water scarcity in ancient cities wasn't just a natural problem, it was a social one. The moment the urban population grew, the moment demand outpaced supply, the moment wells ran low or aqueducts faltered, you could predict exactly who would suffer first. Not the elite living near private fountains, not the merchants with storage jars stacked like miniature fortresses, not the villa owners whose cisterns were large enough to bathe in. No, the burden fell on the poor. Because water inequality existed before plumbing. 1. The poor lived farther from water sources. In most ancient cities, wells, fountains, and aqueduct-fed basins were conveniently located near wealthier districts. Proximity wasn't accidental. Wealthy residents could lobby officials, fund construction, and literally shape where water flowed. Meanwhile, the poor lived on. Outer hillsides, lower flood-prone districts, cramped alleys, far from fountains, cheap land with terrible access. Fetching water meant walking farther, waiting longer in line and competing with dozens of neighbours who were all just as desperate. If you lived near the wealthy sector, you fetched water in minutes. If you lived in the poor sector, it was a half-day chore. Distance alone made survival harder. 2. Storage capacity was a privilege. Wealthy households owned. Large ceramic jars, multiple storage vessels underground, cistern-shaded courtyards to keep water cool. Poor households owned, whatever they could carry, a single cracked jar, a water skin that leaked if you looked at it wrong, a small clay pot that evaporated half its contents on a hot day. Storage mattered because water didn't stay clean and supplies were inconsistent. When the aqueduct ran dry or the well became crowded, the wealthy dipped into reserves, the poor dipped into air. And when heat waves hit or droughts settled in, storage capacity became the difference between dehydration and survival. 3. Social hierarchies controlled water access. Crowded public fountains often operated on an unofficial caste system. Whoever held higher social status got priority. Wealthy families sent servants early. Merchants used their reputation to push ahead. Officials arrived with authority and filled their containers first. The poor, they waited and waited. And by the time their turn arrived, the flow might be slower, muddier, or gone entirely. Wells were no better. If the water level dropped, the poor lost access first because wealthier residents could dig deeper, commission repairs, build private wells, bribe attendants. The poor had complaints, not leverage. 4. Substitutes were worse for the poor. When clean water ran out, the wealthy had alternatives. Wine-watered wine beer imported water from estate servants who could travel farther to fetch safer supplies. Wine wasn't just a luxury beverage, it was a sanitation advantage. Diluted wine killed pathogens, making it safer than untreated water. Weak beer offered similar protection. But the poor? They often could not afford beer. Wine was out of reach except in tiny quantities. Clean water alternatives didn't exist. So when water ran low, they turned to river runoff drainage ditches, questionable puddles, whatever trickled through the cheapest parts of town. These substitutes tested not only thirst, but the immune system, and often won. 5. Poor neighbourhoods were hotspots for contamination. Crowded districts had more waste, fewer drains, overflowing gutters, livestock roaming freely, fewer sanitation services, higher density per household. Rainfall washed refuse downhill, straight into the poorest quarters. Wells in these zones were easily contaminated because runoff didn't ask about social class before flowing. Meanwhile, wealthy districts enjoyed elevated terrain and better drainage, meaning cleaner surroundings and cleaner water. Disease outbreaks consistently hit poor neighbourhoods first and hardest. They didn't just lack water, they lacked safe water. 6. Labourers lost water. Faster. Poor residents often worked physically demanding jobs, hauling goods, farming, construction, pottery, firing, smithing, textile, dyeing, quarrying stone. Hard labour meant constant sweating and faster dehydration. The people who needed water most urgently were those least able to secure it. A wealthy merchant sweating gently while reclining in a shaded courtyard required far less hydration than the labourer hauling grain in the sun. Yet the labourer was the one with limited access, fewer storage options and longer waits. Inequality wasn't abstract, it was physiological. 7. The poor had no buffer against crisis. Everything about their water situation operated on a knife's edge. One bad dry season, one broken aqueduct, one contaminated well, one urban fire that destroyed storage jars, and the poor suffered immediately. Wealthy families used reserves, poor families rationed drops, wealthy families adjusted, poor families collapsed, and because ancient cities lacked social safety nets, the consequences were lethal. Dehydration struck fast, waterborne disease struck faster, without money for healers, servants, safe food, or clean substitutes. Poor residents often died before the cause of the crisis was even identified. 8. Survival was determined. Not just by strength, but by class people like to imagine ancient life as a test of toughness, endurance, and grit. But when it came to water, survival wasn't about strength. It wasn't about luck. It wasn't even about knowledge. It was about proximity. It was about privilege. It was about infrastructure designed to protect some and neglect others. The poor ran out of water first, not because they were careless, but because the system itself positioned them at the end of every line, physically, politically, and economically. Their jars emptied first, their wells dried first, their substitutes poisoned first, their children fell ill first, their neighbourhoods collapsed first. Water scarcity wasn't equal, neither were its consequences. Water inequality existed before plumbing, and in ancient cities it was a matter of life and death. Wealth in the ancient world could buy many advantages: better housing, better food, better privacy, better sandals, but it could not buy freedom from contaminated water. At best, it bought delay, a cushion, a buffer zone, a few extra days or weeks before the same dangers that stalk the poor ultimately reach the marble thresholds of the elite. Because when it came to water, the rule was simple: money buys time, not immunity. 1. Private wells, a luxury with limits. The wealthiest households in ancient cities often dug private wells in their courtyards. These wells provided several advantages. They were closer to home. They were used by fewer people. They were less exposed to public traffic. They allowed the family to avoid crowded communal wells. But private wells were not magically cleaner. They tapped into the same groundwater as the rest of the city. If the aquifer became contaminated by runoff, by waste disposal, by nearby latrines, by rain washing through streets filled with refuse, private wells suffered the same fate as public ones. And because elite homes often kept livestock, even wealthy Romans kept chickens and small animals in their courtyards, contamination could be incredibly local. A private well could be compromised by your own goose. So yes, private wells helped, but only until the neighbourhood water table betrayed everyone at once. 2. Servants fetching. Water bought distance, not safety. Wealthy families did not wait in line at public fountains. They sent servants, dozens in the largest households, to fetch and carry water as needed. Servants could walk farther, search for cleaner sources, visit multiple fountains, make several trips per day, keep the household supplied without inconvenience. This meant the wealthy rarely felt the burden of a water scarcity the way the poor did. They did not sweat in long queues. They did not ration their supply carefully. They did not choose between drinking and cooking. But the servant's workload did not change the water's quality. A cup of water fetched by an exhausted servant was still the same cup of water available to everyone else. If the fountain was contaminated, the wealthy drank contamination carried home in ornate jars. Distance shielded them from the discomfort of shortages, not the bacteria riding inside the jar. 3. Imported water, a symbol of prestige, not safety. Some elites went even further. They imported water from springs outside the city. Clearer, colder, tastier water brought by mule caravan or in sealed amphorae. It was a status symbol on par with owning exotic fabrics or having a personal physician. But imported water wasn't common, wasn't abundant, and wasn't guaranteed clean. Transport containers were rarely sterile. Clay amphora absorbed flavours and residues. Wooden barrels leaked and introduced microbes. Water skins were, well, skins. The kind of vessel that encouraged fermentation, spoilage, and unexpected odours. So imported water was a luxury, yes, but a luxury with a short shelf life and no microbial protection. The wealthy enjoyed variety. They did not enjoy immunity. 4. Elite homes had larger storage, which became larger problems. Wealthy families had multiple storage vessels, large ceramic jars, underground cisterns, cool shaded rooms designed for water preservation. These systems let them stockpile water during times of plenty. But the more water you store, the more opportunity for stagnation algae, insects, fungal growth bacteria thriving in darkness. Large cisterns became slow-moving ecosystems. Without constant cleaning, which was expensive, difficult, and rarely done, these reservoirs turned into private swamps. The poor usually ran out of water before it had time to develop personalities. The rich stored water long enough for it to evolve ambitions. 5. The wealthy had better alternatives. But only while systems worked. The elite consumed diluted wine more consistently than the poor. They enjoyed weak, safer beverages instead of relying solely on water. Their diets gave them slightly more protection, and their kitchens could boil liquids more often because they could afford fuel. But these advantages required stable trade, steady supply lines, functioning aqueduct systems, plentiful firewood, healthy servants, peaceful political conditions. The moment crises struck, drought, siege, famine, epidemic, political turmoil, these advantages evaporated quickly. Imagine a siege, aqueducts cut off, trade halted, fuel scarce, servants sick, private wells drying. Suddenly elite households faced the same contaminated sources as everyone else, just a little bit later. Their delay didn't prevent vulnerability, it only postponed it. 6. Disease did not respect social class. Cholera-like illnesses, dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases moved through cities with remarkable egalitarianism. Servants carried water up stairways, pathogens rode along, cooks prepared food with contaminated supplies, pathogens were stirred in, children played in courtyards where runoff pooled, disease followed quietly behind. If a contaminated source entered a wealthy home, it moved faster than the house staff could respond. Luxurious surroundings offered no protection. Marble floors could not deflect microbes. Decorative fountains recycle the same questionable water. Even emperors, kings, and nobles throughout history succumbed to waterborne diseases. Wealth delayed exposure. It did not eliminate risk. 7. The wealthy benefited from comfort, not cleanliness. The elite experienced easier access, less physical burden, better storage, more beverage variety, cooler water rooms, cleaner surroundings. But all of these comforts addressed the experience of accessing water, not the safety of what they drank. They enjoyed smoother logistics, not healthier outcomes. A gold cup doesn't purify the water it holds. In the end, wealth only bought time. The wealthy did not die first. They did not die most. But they absolutely died from the same causes. Their buffers, private wells, servants, imported water, large cisterns, gave them extra days or weeks during shortages and outbreaks. They could stretch survival longer than the poor. They could postpone collapse, but they could not avoid it. Because in ancient cities, water was the one resource no amount of luxury could truly control. Money buys time, not immunity. Travel in the ancient world sounded exciting. Pilgrims journeying to sacred sites, traders hauling exotic goods, armies marching with purpose. But behind every romantic vision of dusty roads and bustling caravan routes lurked a far less glamorous truth. Human movement was one of the fastest ways for waterborne disease to spread. People didn't just bring stories, spices, artifacts, and news. They brought something else. Intestinal disasters from the last city they visited. In an age before water purification, sanitation systems, or any understanding of microbes, travellers became accidental couriers of disease. Not intentionally, of course. But the moment a traveller filled a water skin at a contaminated well or drank from a questionable river, they carried those pathogens with them, sometimes to the next town, sometimes across entire regions. Forget souvenirs, embroidered tunics, or exotic trinkets. The real souvenir was dysentery. 1. Pilgrims, faithful bodies, unfaithful water sources. Pilgrims travelled in massive groups to shrines, temples, festivals, and holy sites. They slept in temporary shelters, shared communal meals, and, most importantly, drank from every water source along the way. A typical pilgrimage included wells of questionable depth, roadside springs, crowded way stations, strangers sharing buckets, improvised rainwater pits, rivers used by people, animals, and upstream mysteries. Faith was unwavering. Immune systems were overwhelmed. Many pilgrims left home healthy, only to arrive at their destination exhausted, dehydrated, or already suffering diarrhea. Their body became a ticking microbial timepiece, and once they reached the holy site, crowded with thousands of others, all those pathogens mingled like an ill-fated reunion. Afterward, everyone returned home, and so did the diseases. You travelled for spiritual clarity. You came back with gastrointestinal opacity. 2. Traders, the contagion delivery system. But he acknowledged. Trade routes connected ancient cities like veins in a giant continental organism. Spices, metals, fabrics, livestock, wine, oil, and grain moved constantly. So did pathogens. Merchants drank from every available source along the road. They brought clay jars, goatskin water skins, and occasionally barrels, none of which was sanitized. A trader with contaminated water would refill their container at the next stop, unknowingly mixing new water with old microbial baggage. Then they'd sell goods in the marketplace, bump shoulders with locals, share meals, and, crucially, use the city's public water sources. Traders weren't just carrying goods. They carried whatever invisible organisms they collected from 7 towns ago. A single merchant caravan could spread a waterborne contaminant across. Port cities, inland trade hubs, desert oases, rural villages, fishing settlements, all without a single person understanding the pattern. Merchants kept economies alive. They also made sure disease never stayed in one place for long. 3. Armies. Thousands. Marching, drinking, mixing, spreading. If traders and pilgrims spread disease quietly, armies spread it loudly. When thousands of soldiers marched across regions, everything they touched became a health hazard. Wells, rivers, springs, cisterns, animal watering troughs, hastily dug pits of questionable intention. Armies required huge amounts of water daily, for cooking, drinking, animals, bathing, and medical care. They drained local sources completely, then moved on, leaving exhausted and contaminated wells behind. Worse, disease spread within the army fast. Soldiers shared tents, bowls, ladles, water skins, and misery. If one battalion drank contaminated water on day 2, the entire army could be incapacitated by day 4. This wasn't hypothetical. Many historical campaigns were lost not to weapons, but to dysentery-like illnesses ripping through the ranks. Marching into battle, optional. Marching toward the nearest latrine, mandatory. And when that army finally reached a city, either as conquerors, defenders, or unexpected guests, they brought their digestive disasters with them. The occupying force, the local population, the refugees fleeing the conflict, all drank from the same water sources. War didn't merely spread destruction, it spread contamination. 4. Inns and way stations, the microbial mixing bowls. Travellers needed rest stops. Those rest stops needed water, and water at those rest stops needed to come from somewhere. Enter the inn well, a communal container filled by dozens of hands, hauling ropes, leftover containers, animal buckets, and occasionally the contents that gravity decided to contribute. Travellers drank there, their animals drank there, local residents fetched water there. It was a microbial networking event, no invitations required. By the time a traveller left the well-hosted, local bacteria from 3 cities away, bacteria from the last caravan, bacteria from the donkey tied outside. Every guest contributed. Every guest took something home. 5. Disease spread. Because travel connected people faster than cities could respond. Outbreaks rarely stayed local because no one tracked who drank from what, no one connected symptoms to specific sources. No one suspected travellers. No one suspected water cities blamed the weather, divine displeasure, or unlucky omens, but not the pilgrim caravan that arrived last week, or the merchant ship unloading jars at the port. Waterborne diseases were perfect hitchhikers. lightweight, invisible and contagious through the one resource no traveller could avoid using. People wandered for opportunity, for faith, for war, for trade. Pathogens wandered with them, and so, over centuries, ancient travel networks became some of the most efficient disease-spreading systems ever created, long before anyone understood what disease even was. 6. The final irony. Travel promised riches, adventure, enlightenment, and fresh horizons. It also promised stomach cramps, dehydration, and hurried trips behind roadside bushes. Ancient people collected pottery, spices, textiles, stories, myths, and exotic foods. But the most reliable thing they brought home, the souvenir, was dysentery. In everyday ancient urban life, water could be questionable, inconvenient, or quietly plotting against you. But during a siege, water didn't bother with subtlety. It simply vanished. And when it did, all the everyday risks of contamination suddenly felt like fond memories. Because contaminated water could kill you slowly, but no water killed you with a schedule. Clean water access wasn't just reduced under siege conditions, it was cut off entirely. Sieges were designed to starve cities of supplies, hope, morale, and, most brutally, water. Armies didn't need to break walls if they could break a city's hydration. Wells were poisoned or filled with stones. Aqueducts were smashed or diverted. Rivers were blocked or monitored. And inside the walls, every drop became a matter of life and death. Under siege, thirst didn't negotiate. It simply waited. It had time. 1. The psychological shock of losing water. Overnight food shortages were expected. People could ration grain, stretch legumes, even eat things they'd normally avoid. But water couldn't be delayed, stretched, bargained with, or replaced. The moment the city realized its aqueduct was severed or its river access blocked, panic spread quietly, an awful, dry fear in the mouth and throat. Officials immediately inventoried cisterns, jars, and wells. Soldiers guarded water storage. Citizens lined up with containers. Households whispered arguments about rationing. Because everyone knew what this meant. Food gave you weeks. Water gave you days. Children weakened first. Elders next. Workers lost stamina. Defenders lost morale. Fear of dehydration gnawed at every conversation. 2. Survival timelines became terrifyingly short. Without water, the body followed a predictable descent. Day 1, intense thirst, dryness, irritability. Day 2, dizziness, headaches, inability to focus. Day 3, muscle failure, overheating, risk of collapse. Day 4-5, organ stress, confusion, delirium. Death, not dramatic, just quiet shutdown. A strong adult under ideal conditions might last 4 days. Under heat, stress, and fear, maybe 2. Sieges lasted not hours, not days, but weeks or months. The math was not encouraging. 3. Wells became battlegrounds. Inside the walls, cities with wells had hope, but only temporarily. Wells could run dry if the water table dropped, or if overuse drained them faster than nature refilled them. Worse still, besieging armies sometimes dug counterwells to steal underground flow, literally sucking the city's survival out from beneath them. Within the walls, wells became guarded like treasure. Soldiers blocked access. Queues formed before dawn. Fights broke out. Some people bribed guards. Others tried sneaking in at night. And when levels inevitably declined, everyone watched the rope descend deeper and deeper into darkness before scraping against dry stone. A dry well was not a disappointment. It was a death omen. 4. Cisterns and stored water turned into liquid desperation. Cities with cisterns lasted longer, but not as long as legends claim. Stored water was finite, and under siege conditions it corrupted faster. Algae bloomed, insects bred sediment. Thickened, stagnant smell, intensified mold crept along walls. People drank it anyway. When thirst pressed its hand against your throat, you didn't argue about flavour or clarity. You dipped your jar into the greenish shadows and prayed it wasn't your last sip. The wealthy didn't fare much better. Their private cisterns helped them stretch survival a little longer, but not indefinitely. No household, no matter how rich, could store enough water for a prolonged siege. 5. Desperate substitutes. Anything with moisture counted. As days stretched into weeks, the definition of drinkable expanded dramatically. People consumed moisture from fruits and vegetables, if any remained, broth from boiling whatever food scraps were left, water drained from soaked grains, condensation on cool stone walls, dampness wrung from cloths or sponges, the last muddy puddles after rain. Some even chewed leather, belts, shoes, straps, boiled repeatedly to extract tiny amounts of water. In extreme cases, ancient texts describe people collecting morning dew, drop by excruciating drop. When water ran out, dignity evaporated faster. 6. Disease thrived in dehydrated bodies. Ironically, dehydration made the population more vulnerable to diseases that thrived in siege conditions. Fever, infection, dysentery, and waste-borne illnesses. Without water, bodies couldn't fight back. People weakened to the point that even minor infections became fatal. Waste piled up because no one dared use precious water to clean. Latrine pits overflowed, flies multiplied, rats thrived. Paradoxically, a city dying of thirst also drowned in filth. Sieges killed through dehydration, but they finished the job with disease. 7. Armies knew exactly what they were doing. Besieging forces didn't need to storm walls or burn gates. They simply watched. They watched the city ration water. They watched defenders grow sluggish. They heard the coughing, the pleading, the desperation. Sometimes they waited until the city opened its gates willingly, begging for relief. Other times they offered water only in exchange for surrender. A bucket became a bargaining chip. A sip became leverage. Thirst negotiated nothing, but armies negotiated using thirst. 8. Hope died. When the water did, ancient cities could endure hunger with grim determination. They could fight enemy armies with courage. They could rebuild after fire, earthquake, or flood. But thirst broke people. A dehydrated population could not work, fight, repair walls, or resist despair. Their minds fogged, their muscles weakened, their morale evaporated. Entire communities became hollowed-out shells of silent, suffering survivors, waiting for either rescue or collapse. Sometimes rain arrived in time. Sometimes a relief army broke the siege. Sometimes a secret tunnel to a hidden spring saved the city. But often, the ending was far darker. Gates unbarred not through defeat in battle, but through physiological surrender. In the end, water was the true siege engine. Armies hurled stones, built towers, fired arrows, and shouted threats. But none of these matched the quiet devastation of cutting off water. Thirst didn't roar, it whispered, it weakened. It ended resistance without ever lifting a sword. Siege conditions revealed the harshest truth of ancient water dependence. Food can wait, hope can flicker. But without water, there is no negotiation, there is no compromise, there is only time, and not much of it. When faced with murky, suspicious, possibly life-threatening water, ancient people did what humans always do when confronted by danger. They improvised. They didn't understand microbes, but they understood discomfort, cloudiness, bad taste, odd textures, and the unsettling feeling that something extra might be floating in their cup. Thus emerged the earliest water filters: charcoal, sand, gravel, cloth, porous pottery, plant fibers, and an entire spectrum of hopeful inventions. These methods didn't purify water in any modern sense, but they made it look safer, feel safer, and sometimes taste marginally less like despair. Did these filters actually work? Sometimes. A little, but not enough. The ancient world's filtration efforts were impressive for their time, limited by their tools, and ultimately betrayed by everything they couldn't see. It looks safer. It feels safer. It isn't. 1. Cloth filtration. The most popular illusion of safety cloth was humanity's first and most widespread water filter. Simple, cheap, and accessible to nearly everyone. It was used in dozens of cultures to strain water from wells, rivers, jars, and rainwater basins. People filtered water through linen, cotton, wool, tightly woven plant fibers, old garments repurposed into heroic final acts. This method could trap sand bits of straw sediment insects who died doing what they loved, falling into water, visible debris of questionable origin, and indeed, water emerging on the other side of a cloth looked clearer, which meant it must be safer, right? Unfortunately, cloth filters removed big things and none of the dangerous microscopic things. It was a visual filter, not a biological one. If a river was full of dangerous pathogens but happened to look pretty, cloth filtration did nothing but offer false confidence. Still, it was better than nothing, and certainly better than drinking water with a beetle in it. 2. Charcoal filtration. Ancient technology meets wishful thinking. Charcoal has legitimate purifying power. It can absorb impurities, neutralize smells, and reduce certain toxins. Some ancient cultures, notably in parts of India, Egypt, and the Near East, used charcoal as a filtration layer in jars or water basins. Charcoal could remove odors, improve taste, reduce discoloration, trap some organic compounds. Charcoal could not eliminate pathogens, disinfect water, save a city from cholera, turn river sludge into mountain spring clarity. Even so, charcoal filters were prized because they transformed foul-tasting water into something more tolerable. And when your water options range from suspicious to aggressively suspicious, taste mattered. Charcoal filtration was a small step in the right direction, but still far from a solution. 3. Ceramic and porous pot filters, ingenious but imperfect. Some cultures used porous clay containers that allowed water to seep slowly through tiny holes, leaving larger particles behind. These early ceramic filters were clever precursors to much later technologies. Advantages: improved clarity, slow drip process, reduced sediment, reduced visible contaminants. Limitations: pores were too large to stop microorganisms. Filters cracked. Allowing unfiltered water through cleaning the vessels was difficult. Growth of algae or slime inside the porous walls was common. Again, appearance improved, but safety did not dramatically change. 4. Sand and gravel. Filtration. Nature imitated. Poorly. In some places, people experimented with layering sand, gravel, and charcoal to filter water, primitive versions of systems that would later become standard in modern treatment plants. These layers could remove dirt, silt, plant matter, certain pigments, but such filters required constant cleaning, careful construction, and slow percolation to work effectively. Ancient attempts usually lacked consistency. Water often rushed through too quickly, carrying contaminants straight past the filtration layers. A good sand filter worked beautifully. A bad sand filter was just wet sand. Most ancient filters fell somewhere in between. 5. Boiling plus filtering, a combo. People rarely used together. Some regions understood either boiling or filtering, but rarely both. Filtering created the illusion of purity. Boiling required time, fuel, and patience. Using both together would have created the safest water possible in the ancient world. But that combination required surplus firewood, free time matching cultural practices, awareness that both steps mattered. Most households had none of these, so cloth-filtered water went unboiled, boiled water went unfiltered, and pathogens remained unbothered. 6. Cultural beliefs about clear water were stronger than science. People trusted their senses. If water was transparent and lacked floating chunks, they assumed it was pure. Filters reinforced these assumptions because filtered water looked dramatically better. Water clarity became synonymous with safety, a tragic misconception that endured for centuries. Clear water could still carry dysentery bacteria, cholera-like pathogens, parasites invisible to the naked eye, but because filtering removed the ugliness, people believed it removed the danger. A filter that made water look safe was as comforting as a bandage on a broken bone, reassuring, but functionally irrelevant. 7. Filters were maintenance nightmares. Cloth grew mouldy, charcoal lost effectiveness, sand clogged. Porous jars became biofilm playgrounds. You couldn't set it and forget it. Filters required cleaning that most people didn't know how to perform. Poorly maintained filters often became dirtier than the water they were supposed to purify. Imagine pouring contaminated water through a filter that had been sitting in a hot courtyard for months, housing organisms with big dreams and thriving colonies. Sometimes, the filter made the water worse. 8. Filtration was more about hope than hygiene. Despite everything, ancient filtering methods weren't useless. They were just partial solutions. They made water clearer, tastier, less gritty, more drinkable in a psychological sense. And when your daily choices were, drink this filtered but still dangerous water, or risk dehydration, most people chose the filtered water without hesitation. Filtration was never enough to stop epidemics or chronic illness, but it gave people the feeling of control in a world where so much was unpredictable. It wasn't scientific safety, it was emotional safety. Sometimes that mattered. Sometimes it didn't. In the end, ancient filters were clever, but not Cure's charcoal helped. Cloth helped. Sand helped. Ceramic pots helped. But none of these solved the central problem. Waterborne disease isn't visible, and filtration couldn't remove what people couldn't detect. Ancient filters were attempts to tame chaos with the tools available, resourceful, hopeful, and tragically insufficient. The water looked safer. It felt safer. But most of the danger slipped right through. If you lived in an ancient city, your body wasn't just a biological vessel. It was a survival project shaped daily by whatever flowed into your cup. Modern digestive systems, pampered by filtration, chlorination, refrigeration, and warning labels, would crumble instantly if dropped into ancient life. But ancient bodies, they adapted, they endured. They became rugged little ecosystems that learned to negotiate with danger. Because after years of drinking water that ranged from mildly questionable to aggressively untrustworthy, something remarkable happened. Your stomach developed a personality, and it was not a gentle one. One, adaptation through relentless exposure. Ancient populations were exposed to pathogens constantly, not once, not occasionally, but every single day. Their immune systems didn't get holidays. Their gut flora didn't retire. Their bodies ran a full-time training program in microbial diplomacy. Every sip of contaminated water introduced new invaders. Every meal washed in that water introduced even more. Every childhood illness that didn't kill taught the immune system a lesson. By adulthood, survivors were walking archives of immunological experience. This wasn't immunity in the modern sense. No vaccines, no sterilization, no targeted protection. It was rough, improvised, cumulative resistance earned the hard way, through repeated infections that slowly taught the body not to panic. Some pathogens, like those causing chronic gastrointestinal issues, became so common that the immune system stopped treating them as emergencies. Instead, it shifted into a quiet, weary tolerance. Not triumph, not health, just familiarity. Your stomach didn't win the battle. It negotiated a ceasefire. 2. Childhood. The first brutal training phase. Ancient children faced microbial onslaughts before they could walk. The ones who survived infancy, already an accomplishment, often grew into adults with shockingly resilient digestive systems. Children drank diluted wine, weak beer, water from shared vessels, runoff from courtyards, whatever liquid was available when thirst struck. Each exposure reshaped their internal defences. By adolescence, their stomachs resembled bouncers at a chaotic tavern, tired, stern, and unwilling to be surprised by anything that stumbled through the door. But the cost was heavy. Those who didn't adapt didn't survive. Natural selection wasn't theoretical. It was personal. 3. Gut tolerance. Wasn't comfort, it was functionality. When chronic pathogens live in your intestines for years, the body adjusts in strange ways. Inflammation becomes background noise, nutrient absorption improves despite disruption. Diarrhea becomes episodic instead of constant gut bacteria. Learn to compete with invaders. The immune system becomes desensitized to mild threats. People weren't free of disease. They were simply capable of functioning with it. A modern traveller might collapse after one cup of ancient water. An ancient labourer could drink that same water and go straight back to hauling bricks. Resilience was earned, not inherent. 4. Partial immunity. Strong enough to survive, not enough to prevent illness. Survivors developed partial immunity to certain microbes, enough to prevent rapid death, not enough to avoid symptoms entirely. Someone might fall ill, briefly recover quickly, retain resistance for future exposures. But this wasn't universal protection. A new pathogen, a stronger strain, or a contaminated source with unusually high microbial concentration could bypass defenses instantly. Adaptation reduced risk. It didn't eliminate it. Ancient people were battle-hardened, not invincible. 5. Regional stomachs. Became local champion City A's water contained one microbial cocktail. City B's water contained a different one. People adapted to their local environment. Their stomachs learned the terrain. But when they travelled, disaster. Visitors often became ill within a day, not because the new water was objectively worse, but because their bodies didn't recognise its microbial inhabitants. Locals drank it without blinking. Travellers questioned all their life choices. This phenomenon still occurs today in mild form, but in the ancient world it was a dramatic divide. Your stomach was loyal to your hometown and refused to collaborate with outsiders. 6. Adaptation. Was physical, cultural and behavioural. Ancient people learned tricks that helped, not scientifically, but practically. Drinking from higher-flowing water rather than stagnant pools, choosing morning water from wells before sediment disturbed diluting water with alcohol, eating foods that ease digestion, avoiding visibly dirty sources, recognizing seasonal illness patterns. These habits layered protection on top of biological adaptation. You survived not only because your stomach was stubborn, but because your community stored centuries of accumulated wisdom, even if they didn't understand the mechanisms behind it. 7. But adaptation had limits that disaster exploited. All the resilience in the world could not protect against cholera-like outbreaks, dysentery surges, contaminated shared cisterns, siege conditions, drought-induced concentration of pathogens, upstream contamination from another city. Partial immunity was like having a strong umbrella. It helped, but it didn't stop the storm. When epidemics struck, even the most experienced stomachs suffered. When water sources failed completely, no amount of adaptation mattered. Evolution favoured those who survived long enough to reproduce. It did not promise comfort. It did not promise longevity. In the end, adaptation wasn't triumph. It was survival math. Ancient people didn't have clean water. They had stomachs that refused to quit. Bodies learned to endure what the environment delivered. Pathogens, parasites, sediment, runoff, and the full microbial cast of ancient city life. This wasn't robustness in the heroic sense. It was resignation turned into biology. Your stomach didn't just digest food. It negotiated peace treaties. It adapted, rebelled, compromised, adjusted, and kept you alive in spite of everything. Your stomach had a personality, and endurance was its defining trait. After reviewing the horrors of ancient water, you might reasonably ask, why on earth did people keep moving into cities? Surely after enough dysentery, after watching a neighbour faint at a well, after hearing rumours that the river has opinions again, someone would declare, enough! I'm going back to the countryside where at least the cow respects me. But no, cities didn't shrink. They didn't deter people. They exploded in size. Because people don't move to cities to live longer. They move to live better, briefly. And ancient cities, for all their filth, risk and questionable fumes, offered something the countryside never could. Opportunity. 1. Cities meant trade, money, and a chance to escape fate. In the countryside, life followed a predictable script. Farm, obey the seasons, endure the winters, hope the harvest didn't betray you. Mobility was rare. Wealth was rarer. Cities offered escape. Trade hubs buzzed with movement, ships docking, caravans unloading, merchants shouting prices with theatrical enthusiasm. Goods from distant lands, spices, fabrics, tools, fish, wine, metals, were all available in quantities unimaginable in rural life. A person could step into a city with nothing but a hope and a basket of something to sell, and walk out, theoretically, with connections, coin, and upward momentum. Waterborne disease was a price. Economic possibility was the reward. People made the trade every day. 2. Safety in numbers, at least politically. The countryside was vulnerable. Bandits roamed. Armies marched unpredictably. Wolves and wild animals were real threats. A lone family farm could vanish without anyone noticing for weeks. Cities, with their walls, guards, night watch, and dense populations, offered protection. Fortified gates, organized militias, centralized leadership, faster gossip networks about danger, stronger bargaining power against invading forces. Sure, disease might ravage a city faster, but armies ravage farmland faster still. If you had to choose between the possibility of dysentery and the certainty of an invading force trampling your crops, many chose dysentery. At least disease didn't swing a sword. Urban water could kill you slowly. An enemy raid might kill you instantly. People picked the danger with better odds. 3. Cities offered work, a lot of it. Urban centres always needed. Builders, potters, blacksmiths, scribes, servants, market vendors, transporters, entertainers, soldiers, priests, artisans. Even the lowest paying jobs offered cash, not just food or grain. Cash meant autonomy. Cash meant possibility. Cash meant the chance to buy better tools, better clothing, better food, or eventually move into a better part of the city. Sure, you might spend your evenings drinking slightly questionable beer, but at least you had a future to dream about. 4. Social mobility, from nobody to somebody. Cities rewarded ambition more than birth. A merchant could rise. A skilled builder could gain patrons. A craftsman could open a workshop. A clever trader could start a network. In rural communities, social roles were inherited and rigid. In cities, they were fluid. Water might shorten your lifespan, but cities expanded your possibilities. Many people preferred 10 risky years in a city over 50 predictable years on a farm. 5. Community, culture, and the thrill of not being isolated. Isolation was dangerous. Villages were small, options were limited, and entertainment choices hovered between. Watching goats, discussing weather, complaining about grain taxes, going to bed early, because there was nothing else to do. Cities offered festivals, theatres, taverns, religious ceremonies, street performers, lively markets, public baths, libraries and lecture halls. In some cultures, people crave stimulation, novelty, and human interaction, even if it comes with some intestinal consequences. Urban life was vibrant, chaotic, loud, alive, risky, absolutely, boring, never. 6. access to specialized skills and services cities had. Physicians, questionable but enthusiastic, midwives, healers, metalworkers, stonemasons, clerks, astrologers, tutors, legal advocates, scribes, bakers, carpenters. If you needed something done, built, repaired, healed, blessed, cursed or recorded, you found it in the city. Rural life couldn't compete with the density of skill. Did the doctor sometimes prescribe goose fat and prayers? Yes. Was he still more helpful than no doctor at all? Also, yes. People moved to cities because help, imperfect as it was, existed. 7. Religion and administration pulled people. In sacred temples, shrines, administrative capitals, courts, and religious ceremonies drew populations into cities. Leaders needed bureaucrats, soldiers, priests, accountants, messengers, builders, and labourers. Rural youth who wanted to make something of themselves headed for the urban centre like moths to a smoky oil lamp. A city was the beating heart of civilization, even if that heart occasionally skipped beats due to dysentery. 8. Hope was stronger than risk. People understood the dangers. They weren't naive. They knew the water was suspicious. They knew disease spread quickly in tight quarters. They knew children died more often. They knew sieges could cut off survival instantly. But they also knew cities offered opportunity, protection, money culture, community, upward mobility. Most importantly, cities offered hope. Hope that tomorrow could be better. Hope that you could earn enough to move into a cleaner district. Hope that your children might grow up educated. Hope that fortune might smile on your trade stall. Hope that you could rewrite your story. People accepted water risk the way modern people accept pollution, traffic, stress, and long work hours. Not because they love danger, but because they love possibility more. In the end, cities grew, because people wanted more than survival. Life in the countryside was safer for your digestive tract. Life in the city was richer for your ambitions. Urban centres offered everything humans desired except reliable water, and people chose that trade willingly. People don't move to cities to live longer. They move to live better. Briefly perhaps, but brilliantly. Here we are at the end of the journey. A long story of rivers that betrayed you, wells that judged you, cisterns that plotted against you, and aqueducts that delivered water with enthusiasm but not purity. After all this, you may be wondering whether anyone in the ancient world survived long enough to do anything besides drink suspicious water and regret it. And surprisingly, they did. Because here is the strange truth, the dual ending to every ancient water story. The good news, you might survive longer than expected. The bad news, every sip is a gamble you don't understand. Ancient people didn't know why some days they felt fine, and other days they felt like their intestines had filed for independence. They didn't know why one well caused no trouble while another turned entire neighbourhoods into cautionary tales. They didn't know why a river that sparkled beautifully at dawn could devastate a city by dusk. They didn't know, but they kept drinking anyway. Because what choice did they have? 1. The good news, survival was possible, even common. Despite catastrophic outbreaks, relentless disease, and chronic digestive chaos, most people didn't drop dead the moment they sipped water. The human body is astonishingly adaptable, and ancient bodies were masterclasses in resilience. Survival came from partial immunity earned through childhood exposure, gut tolerance developed over years, constant adaptation to environmental microbes, cultural habits like drinking weak alcohol, occasional purification methods that helped just enough sheer physiological stubbornness. This resilience meant most people lived long enough to work, marry, raise children, farm fields, build temples, gossip at markets, and argue about taxes. People didn't merely exist, they lived entire lives shaped by ambition, love, conflict, hope, and routine. But their survival wasn't guaranteed by knowledge. It was earned through biology and luck. 2. The bad news, danger never left the cup. The real terror of ancient water wasn't its deadliness. It was its opacity. Every cup was a question. Every sip was a surprise. Every source carried invisible risks that no one, not commoners, not priests, not healers, not kings, could detect. Your senses couldn't help you. Smell lied, taste lied, sight lied. Clarity meant nothing. Freshness meant nothing. Even tradition meant nothing. Just because a well spared you last month didn't mean it would spare you today. Ancient people lived with a silent roulette wheel in their hands, and because they didn't understand the rules, they believed every illness came from spirits, stars, winds, curses, moods of the gods, or moral failings. The water that quietly poisoned them was never blamed, because it never confessed. 3. Survival wasn't logical. It was statistical. A person didn't survive because they drank the right water. They survived because they avoided catastrophe by chance. Perhaps they happened to drink when the water table was cleaner, their body tolerated certain pathogens better. Their well wasn't contaminated that season. Their household habits unknowingly reduced risk. They drank more weak beer than water. They lived uphill instead of downhill. People attributed survival to virtue, fate, discipline, or divine favour. But more often than not, survival came from probability. Ancient cities were vast experiments in microbiology, and not everyone failed. 4. The good news, you didn't die of thirst. Despite everything, most people did not perish from dehydration. Even in sieges, droughts, or poor districts, water, however questionable, existed often enough to keep life going. Humanity does not persist because conditions are perfect. It persists because it refuses to quit. Ancient people drank courageously, or carelessly, or desperately, but they drank. And that's why civilization survived, grew and thrived. Water was dangerous, but not drinking was worse. 5. The bad news. Optimism was its own hazard. If there is one defining trait of ancient water use, it is optimism. Not scientific optimism, emotional optimism. The kind of optimism that makes you say, that well looks fine. This cup smells normal. The river is pretty today. My neighbour didn't die when he drank from it. How bad could it be? Optimism convinced people to lower the bucket, fill the jar, pour the cup, and swallow the unknown. Optimism built cities. Optimism filled marketplaces. Optimism sustained community habits. Optimism kept people alive long enough to repopulate. And optimism, tragically, also killed. Because when danger is invisible, optimism becomes a blindfold. You didn't die of thirst, you died of optimism. 6. Final reflection. Humanity survived. Not because it understood water, but in spite of it. The ancient world was messy, vibrant, ambitious, filthy, hopeful, resilient, and utterly chaotic. Water was at the centre of all of it, supporting life one day, sabotaging it the next. What saved ancient populations wasn't science, it wasn't infrastructure, it wasn't sanitation, it was human adaptability, communal habits, partial immunity, stubborn biology, social cooperation, luck. Ultimately, the story of water in ancient cities isn't a tale of pure misery. It's a reminder that humanity can flourish even in conditions it barely understands. People built empires with questionable hydration. They created art, laws, philosophies, monuments, and myths, while drinking water that modern standards would classify as a biological weapon. The good news? You often survived longer than expected. The bad news? Every sip was a gamble you didn't understand.